Chapter 557. Su Qingjuan's expression suddenly changed, and she became nervous. She hastily asked, "Master, what happened? Are my father and mother all right?" Masato Kihara shook her head and said, "The news just came from Fuyunji. It said that a riot has recently occurred in Kunwa City. The cause is still unknown for the time being, but in the end, it caused a lot of trouble. Several aristocratic families in the city were invaded and suffered varying degrees of damage. Among them were the Bai family, the Sun family, the Lu family, the Yi family, and the Su family." Seeing that Su Qingjuan's complexion had turned pale and looked worried, Masato Kihara hastily shook her hand and said, "Don't worry. They didn't say anything about casualties. They just mentioned that each family suffered losses. It's very likely that their family's property was damaged. But I know the situation at home, and I also understand that what you're most worried about right now is your parents at home, so I came to tell you." At this point, Masato Kihara paused for a moment and revealed a loving and gentle expression. "If you want to go back, I'll help you ask your martial uncle Tianlan for a favor and let you go back." Su Qingjuan's heart was moved and she hastily said, "There's no need, master. I just received a task and have to go back to Kunlun Party. It's best if we can solve the two matters at the same time." Masato Kihara was startled, but she immediately nodded and said, "There's actually such a coincidence. That's good. No matter what happened at home, you should go back and take a look." Su Qingjun nodded and said, "Yes, disciple understands. I'll pack my luggage now and go to Fuyunji to explain the situation. I'll go back tomorrow." Masato Kihara then pulled her to the side, carefully exhorted her, and asked if she needed any help. After Su Qingjun said that everything was fine, she smiled and told her that it was rare for her to go back, and that there seemed to be nothing urgent in Immortal City recently. If no one urged her, she could stay in Kunlun City and didn't need to rush back. Su Qingjun was a bit hesitant. She glanced at Kunlun Palace Hall and asked in a low voice, "Master, this isn't good, is it?" Masato Kihara secretly sighed in her heart. She asked this question instead of directly refusing, and saying that she would come back as soon as possible after finishing her business, which meant that Su Qingjun was still worried about her parents and wanted to stay in Kunwa City to accompany them for a while. She was just too embarrassed to say it before. Who said that there were no close friends in the world? His expression didn't change. He just smiled and said, "It's not a big deal. Didn't I just say that there's nothing serious here? Even if there's something, there are many people here to support it. There's still your master and martial uncle Tianlan. With these people here, do you think the sky will collapse without you?" Su Qingjun was a bit surprised and said, "Yes." Masato Kihara said again, "You can go back without worry. You don't need to worry about Zhengxianmeng. If there's really something that needs you to come back, I'll write to you and explain it. You can come back by yourself then." Su Qingjun looked grateful and nodded. "Yes, thank you, master." Masato Kihara smiled kindly. He looked at Su Qingjun and sighed in his heart. After saying a few more words, he left. Su Qingjun turned around and returned to the room. She saw White Lotus standing on the side with a slight frown. She seemed to be thinking about something. When Su Qingjun walked over, White Lotus cast a glance at her and smiled. However, the smile seemed a bit forced. She said, "Big sister, are you going back?" Su Qingjun said, "Yes. Something happened at home. My parents are old, and they don't have a son to take care of them. I'm a bit worried, so I still have to go back and have a look." White Lotus nodded. At this time, she didn't say anything more. She simply said, "Then be careful on your way back. Have a safe journey." Su Qingjun took a deep look at her and said, "I know. Thank you." Masato Kihara left Su Qingjuan's house and walked along the road. Soon after, he came to a fork in the road. One side was the main road. Walking forward, he could see the majestic cornice of Fuyunji Hall and Kunlun Hall. The other side was a little smaller. It turned into the depths of the forest. Looking at the direction, it was to the back of the mountain. Masato Kihara looked in the direction of the two halls. He looked calm and indifferent. Then he waved his sleeve and picked up the bottle gourd at his waist. He found a stone on the side of the road and sat down. Then he raised his head and drank to his heart's content. When the wine entered his throat, the fragrance of the wine overflowed. He slightly narrowed his eyes and let out a satisfied sigh. At the same time, there was a flash of light in his eyes. He glanced around in front of and behind him. There was no one nearby. Masato Kihara sat for a while and drank 2 mouthfuls of wine. He was like an old and tired drunkard. Then he slowly stood up and hung the bottle gourd at his waist. He slowly strode forward and walked on the path. The path led into the distance. After entering the forest, the light was a little dim. Masato Kihara walked all the way. His pace seemed slow but was actually fast. Soon, he walked near the exit on the other side of the forest. At this moment, a figure suddenly came out from behind a big tree near the edge of the forest. He waved at him. Masato Kihara glanced at him. His expression didn't change. It was as if he had already expected that there would be someone here. He didn't say anything and just walked straight over. In the dim shadow of the tree stood a man who was much younger than him. However, in terms of seniority, he was actually of the same generation as him. His position in the sect, and even in Zhangxianmeng, was probably even higher than him. There weren't many people like this. Lu Chen was one of them. Seeing Masato Kihara coming over, Lu Chen nodded to him as a greeting. Then he asked, "How is it?" Masato Kihara said, "It's fine. She promised to go back and will leave tomorrow." Lu Chen looked relieved and nodded without saying anything. Spiritual Master Mu Yuan looked at him and couldn't help but ask, "You were the one who told me about this. Why didn't you tell Qingjun yourself? Instead, you came to me and talked to me for half a day, saying that I still owe you a favor from back then, and wanted me to help you?" Lu Chen snorted and said, "Anyway, you probably forgot that favor on purpose. It's useless to talk about other things. Just use it on this." Masato Kihara spat and said angrily, "Nonsense, am I that kind of person?" Lu Chen was too lazy to pay attention to him. He just said, "I mentioned to her about going back to Kunlun Mountain." However, a few days after that, Qingjun didn't respond. Most likely she was still hesitant, or didn't dare to fully believe my words. But it's not a big deal. She should be like this. But it's different for you. Among the few people she trusts the most in this world, you should be one of them. Master Mu Yuan smiled, but subconsciously raised his head to look at the sky. Lu Chen also followed his gaze and looked up. Through the gaps between the branches and leaves of the trees, they could see the clear sky outside. White clouds floated in the blue sky. A breeze blew and the world was quiet. The weather is good. Yes. Tell her to leave early. If the weather turns bad, it may be difficult to travel. Yes. When you came to find me, did you also feel that something was wrong? I don't know whether it's right or not, but there is such an outstanding disciple behind Tetsu. It doesn't matter if I'm old, but if it's possible, I should at least leave some hope so that I can face the spirits of the ancestors in heaven. Well, she is fortunate to have a master like you. Chapter 558. Deep within the prison of Fuyunji, Lu Chen and Shuang stood side by side in the quiet room. There were 5 to 6 people standing behind them. Judging from their attire, they were the elites of Fuyunji. Chen He, who had been instigated by Lu Chen, or rather, forced to side with Fuyunji, was also standing expressionlessly among the crowd. As for Lu Chen's trusted aide, Old Ma, he was also here. However, he was standing at the back of the crowd. His brows were tightly furrowed, as though he had a lot on his mind. Everyone's gaze was looking forward. The room was filled with a thick and unpleasant stench of blood. The place was brightly lit, but most of the time, it did not make one feel happy. Oppression and terror were the main themes of the place. This was the interrogation room of Fuyunji. Other than the people here, there were many torture tools. With the reputation of Fuyunji, this was a dark place that outsiders did not know about. Perhaps it was because of the fear of reputation that, other than the reliable and trustworthy members of Fuyunji's main hall, even the righteous people of Zhangxianmeng, or the elite disciples of the Kunlun party and other famous factions were not allowed to step into this place. All the people of Fuyunji, who were standing, were silent. However, there were beast-like panting and painful moans in the room. A few people were interrogating a prisoner in the middle of the room. From the messy hair and wounds, one could see the outline of that person's face. It was Fan Tue, the devil cult sorcerer who was captured a few days ago. The people at the side did not look like fiends. In fact, most of the time, the faces of these people who were interrogating Fan Tue were cold and numb. Perhaps only those who were truly numb to life and pain could work in such a dark and terrifying place. They continued to inflict pain on Fan Tue's body expressionlessly. When they reached their limit, the prisoner screamed continuously. His screams suddenly became louder, and then suddenly stopped. Then his head tilted to the side and he fell unconscious. Those people stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Shui Ying and Lu Chen. However, the two of them didn't seem to have any change in their expressions. Instead, the people standing behind them began to stir. Chunhee, who was in the crowd, looked toward Fan Tue with a complicated gaze. He then glanced at Lu Chen's back, as though he wanted to say something. However, in the end, he pursed his lips tightly and did not say a word. Fan Tue had clearly said everything that needed to be said. If he did not say anything in such a situation, it was likely that he had nothing else to say. He could see this situation, and he felt that the people around him could see it as well. There was no need to torture him anymore. However, it was one thing to see it, but it was another to say it out loud. Even though there was a commotion in the crowd around him at the start, no one said a word until now. Hence, the gazes of the people at the front and back all landed on the man and woman, waiting for their decision. Shuang didn't say anything, and neither did Lu Chen. It seemed as if they didn't care about this matter at all, causing this awkward silence to persist for a while. It also caused the atmosphere in the room to become inexplicably tense. In the past, there would undoubtedly only be one person who could make the final decision in such a situation. No one had any objections, and the person who should speak would not back down. Fuyunji had always been a swift and decisive Hall. However, the situation had changed. Was this change good or bad? It was definitely good. Even if there was a little bad, no one would say anything. This was because this was the decision of the High and Mighty Lord True Lord. Perhaps there were some people who thought further. True Lord Tianlan had sent his only personal disciple, who was also the future successor of all his businesses, to Fuyunji. Even though he was only assisting Shui Ying on the surface, could it be possible that he was dissatisfied with the current situation in Fuyunji? What was the old man thinking in his heart? The awkward stalemate continued. The gazes of the two people continued to look forward calmly, as though they were waiting for the people around them to speak. Compared to the silence of the two, the expressions of the people around them started to stiffen. They looked at each other with worried gazes. Even the few executioners at the front with cold expressions looked over in shock. No one knew how much time had passed, but no one cared about the unconscious Fan Tue on the ground. Or rather, the people beside him did not know if they should care about him. They were also intimidated by the cold and stiff atmosphere, and did not dare to open their mouths. Finally, Shuang moved her head slightly. Then, she turned around to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen also moved his body. He was very polite to this senior of Fuyunji. There was even a hint of a smile on his face. Junior Lu, what do you think we should do next? Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, I will leave everything to Hall Master Shui. Shuang looked at him and nodded. After a moment of silence, she said, I think that this person should have told us everything he knows. We will not be able to get anything out of him, even if we continue to question him. Hence, I think that we should temporarily detain this person. We will continue to pursue the demon of the devil cult and the missing elder ghost. What do you think? Very good, Lu Chen said. Shuang waved her hand. The people around her immediately heaved a sigh of relief. The atmosphere in the room also became much more relaxed. The few executioners bowed to Shui Ying and Lu Chen. Then they hurriedly lifted the unconscious Fan Tue and walked out of the interrogation room. Following that, Shuang also led her people toward the door and prepared to leave. However, just as she was about to reach the door, she suddenly heard Lu Chen's voice coming from behind her. He said, Hall Master Shui, actually there is another matter. Master has asked me once over the past 2 days. He said that even though the situation has been settled and the devil cult has been defeated, the main culprit, Elder Ghost, has yet to be brought to justice. This is a fly in the ointment. He asked me to ask you about when we will be able to capture him. Shui Ying's body suddenly paused. Her footsteps came to a halt. The few experts from the floating cloud division behind her also revealed a subtle expression. The surrounding atmosphere once again became quiet. However, this time the silence did not last for long. Shui Ying quickly replied, "I have already reported this matter to the Lord. Did he not tell you?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "He indeed did not tell him." Shui Ying said, "I have already informed the Lord of the entire situation. He knows what to do. Junior brother Lu, is there anything else?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "There is nothing else. Take care, Hall Master Shui." Shui Ying nodded and led her people out. Only Lu Chen and Old Ma were left in the room. Old Ma slowly walked over from a corner. He pursed his lips and looked at the empty doorway. He lowered his voice and said to Lu Chen, "This person is not to be trifled with." Lu Chen's expression did not change. He said, "I know." Old Ma sneered and said, "You knew and still went to provoke her?" Lu Chen said indifferently, "Do you know why she suddenly called me junior brother Lu recently?" Old Ma was startled. He frowned and said, "It can't be." Lu Chen sneered. His gaze was deep as he looked in the direction of the door. After a while he said, "Let's go. This place is filled with yin qi. I don't know how many ghosts are wandering around here." Chapter 559. Walking out of the prison. When the sun shone on them again, Lu Chen and Old Ma both felt a warm aura, as if they had walked out of the gloomy hell and returned to the lively world. Old Ma sighed and suddenly asked in a low voice, "Do you think Senior Immortal knows about the situation in this prison?" Lu Chen glanced at him and walked forward. Old Ma followed beside him. After they were a distance away from the prison, Lu Chen said, "Why are you asking this?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "Just asking. Both of us used to work outside, risking our lives on the line. How would we know there is such a place in Fuyunji?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "I didn't know about it before. I only found out about this place after I went to Sky Dragon Mountain with that damn Baldy to take in disciples. But you are not a kind person. This kind of place will definitely exist. At most, the methods are a little more vicious." He paused as if he thought of something. After hesitating for a moment, he said, "Are you afraid that if this matter spreads out, it will ruin his reputation outside?" Old Ma said, "Although the people here are all devil cult demons, the methods are indeed too cruel. If this really spread out, it will be detrimental to Senior Immortal's reputation." Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "Whether that Baldy of mine has been here, or whether he knows that Shui Ying and the others from Fuyunji are torturing the devil cult people here, I don't know. In my opinion, he probably doesn't know, but it's not that he was deceived. I mean, that damn Baldy probably doesn't care to know." Old Ma was startled and asked with some doubt, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen said indifferently, "In my opinion, he probably doesn't care about the life and death of these people, and he can't be bothered to come here. To him, the most important thing is the result. As long as Fuyunji tells him the result of the interrogation, it's fine. As for what happens during the interrogation, he probably doesn't care at all." He glanced at Old Ma and said, "Those evil people's life and death, suffering, all kinds of horrible scenes where life is worse than death. In my bald-headed Shifu's heart, it doesn't have any weight at all. He won't have any pity for those people, so he probably won't care if these things are spread out or not." Old Ma was silent. After a while he said, "So for so long, these things in Fuyunji's prison have never been spread out. It's all thanks to Blood Warbler." Lu Chen said straightforwardly, "Although this woman has a subtle relationship with me now, and we don't get along, but after so many years, she must be the dead Baldy's most loyal subordinate." Speaking of this, he sneered and said, "The dead Baldy's status is too high, and his character is even more arrogant to the point of looking down on everyone. These dirty things naturally have to be done by Blood Warbler and the other Fuyunji people. It's really hard on her. After so many years, she can actually endure the dead Baldy until now." Old Ma pushed him, looked around and snorted, "You talk less." Lu Chen glanced at him from the corner of his eyes and said, "Are you going to snitch?" Old Ma was angry and said angrily, "Do I look like that kind of person to you?" Lu Chen said, "You don't look like that now. but if you were given a mountain of gold, you would look like that kind of person from head to toe. Old Ma spat and snorted at him, then thought for a while and said, "What do you plan to do now? The evil cult's power is gone. It's basically impossible for them to rise again. Without external enemies, why do I feel that Hallmaster Shui is starting to target you?" Lu Chen's expression was calm and said, "Don't worry, no matter what happens, as long as I cling on to the dead Baldy's thigh, I will naturally have nothing to worry about." Old Ma was stunned for a moment, and couldn't help but size him up with a strange expression on his face. Lu Chen asked, "Why are you looking at me like this?" Old Ma said, "I remember when we were in Qingshitang village. You weren't like this. Although the days back then were hard, I remember that you seemed to have a backbone. Even the kindness that Lord Perfected Immortal occasionally passed to you. You didn't even care. Why now?" Lu Chen said, "Can backbone save my life? Can pride give me status? In this huge celestial city, there are so many people who want to climb up. Why should I pretend to be virtuous?" He smiled. His gaze suddenly became a little blurred, but very quickly it became clear again. He smiled bitterly to himself and said softly, "Actually, there are virtuous people. Everyone's luck is different, and I think she probably doesn't have so many thoughts. As the saying goes, one who has no desires is upright." Old Ma frowned and said, "Who are you talking about?" Lu Chen smiled and didn't say anything. In the outskirts of Celestial City, Masato Kahara personally sent Su Qingjun here. Looking at the road stretching into the distance, he smiled and stopped in his tracks. Su Qingjun also knew that it was time to part, so she turned to look at Masato Kahara and said softly, "Master, this is enough to send you here. Please go back." Masato Kahara nodded and said, "Be careful on the road. When you go back, treat your parents well. They only have you as a daughter. Treat them well." Su Qingjun replied with an N and said, "Disciple understands." After saying that, her gaze subconsciously swept in the direction of the road, but only saw that the road was empty. Occasionally there were a few pedestrians passing by, but they were all unfamiliar faces. There was no familiar figure in her memory. Masato Kihara saw Su Qingjun's expression, and also saw the trace of deliberately hidden in her eyes, but still couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He shook his head slightly, although he knew that there were some things he shouldn't say, but the girl in front of him was his most beloved disciple. In the end he still couldn't help but sigh and said, "Today, other than me, no one else came." How intelligent was Su Qingjun? She immediately heard the hidden meaning in Masato Kahara's words, and her cheeks turned red, saying, "Master, what are you saying?" Kahara said, "Qingjun, there are some things that I shouldn't say, but seeing how you're behaving, let me put it this way. Lu Chen isn't a good match for you, so you shouldn't waste your efforts on him." Su Qingjun was startled, probably because she didn't expect Masato Kahara to directly mention Lu Chen's name, and said it so simply and crudely. She was stunned for a moment. Masato Kahara frowned and said, "Qingjun, listen to Master. After returning to the mountain, cultivate and recuperate well. With your talent, your future is bound to be boundless. There is no need to get together with him, otherwise, you will only destroy yourself." Su Qingjun was silent for a long time, then nodded and said, "Master, I understand that you are doing this for my own good. In fact, I have already made a decision in my heart. Ever since he killed Sumo, I will never have any relationship with him again. Please rest assured, Master." Masato Kihara smiled, a gratified expression on his face. Su Qingjun bowed and bid farewell, then turned around and set out on the road back home. She looked at the distant mountains, and when there was finally no one around, she sighed softly and said to herself in a low voice, "Everyone, parents, master, and even friends, say that you are not a good person. Lu Chen, Lu Chen, what kind of person are you?" Chapter 560. In the Starry Hall, Supreme Guyu sat alone in the main hall, looking up at the strange starry sky map carved on the dome of the main hall. Her expression was slightly complicated, her eyes flickered slightly, and she was silent. At the entrance of the main hall, two children stood by the door and waited. From time to time, they would look back into the main hall, but every time they saw almost the same scene. They then looked at each other, and saw the helplessness in each other's eyes. At this moment, footsteps sounded. The two children turned around and saw a middle-aged man in a Taoist robe striding over from outside the starry hall. The two children recognized this person. It was Supreme Guyu's disciple, Fengze, one of the closest disciples of Supreme Guyu. When Fengze came near, the two children came forward to greet him. Fengze nodded and said in a low voice, "Help me inform them." The two children looked at each other with a troubled expression. One of the older children standing on the left said, "Senior brother, Master has instructed us to not let anyone disturb him." Fengze was startled for a moment. He raised his head and glanced at the hall. From afar, he could see the Guyu true lord in deep thought. He could not help but frown as he asked in a low voice, "How long has Master been inside?" The child on the right said, "It has been more than an hour." Fengze hesitated for a moment, but after a while, as if struggling in his heart, he still made a decision and said, "I have an urgent matter I must tell Master. This matter concerns Supreme Taihu of Heavenly Law Hall. It cannot be delayed. Help me go in and inform him." The two children were taken aback, and then a bitter expression appeared on their faces. However, Fengze's status in the starry hall was quite high, and with his serious expression at the moment, the two children did not dare to be negligent. So after hesitating, the two children still walked into the main hall. Fengze looked at them from behind, and saw that the two children walked carefully all the way to Supreme Guyu's side, and then reported in a low voice. Supreme Guyu's face did not show any obvious anger, but after listening for a moment, she turned her head to look at the door. Fengze hurriedly bowed. Supreme Guyu's expression did not change, and after a moment of silence, she softly said to the two children. The two children seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then they did not dare to say anything else and quickly bowed and left. Fengze had been waiting anxiously for a long time. When the two children finally came out, he greeted them and walked into the hall. However, at this moment, two arms suddenly appeared in front of him. It was the two Taoist children who had reached out in unison to stop him. Fengze was stunned and asked in surprise, "What are you doing?" The two Taoist children had apologetic expressions on their faces, but their expressions were resolute. They said softly, "Senior brother Fengze, please wait here for a moment. Master is currently studying the star atlas and shouldn't be distracted." Fengze was stunned for a moment, and did not react for a moment. After a while he said in astonishment, "Did you not mention to teacher that I have an important matter regarding immortal Taihu?" The Tao child sighed and said, "I did, senior brother Fengze, but Master told me to do so. You should wait a little longer." Fengze was speechless. He could not help but look into the hall again, only to see that immortal Guyu had returned to her original appearance of looking at the dome of the star atlas. She did not even glance over here. Fengze was speechless and felt a little uneasy. He secretly recalled his actions in the past few days and thought that he was still as respectful to Master as usual. It seemed that he did not offend Master in any way. What was going on? However, since immortal Guyu had asked the Taoist child to pass this message, no matter what the purpose was, and whether there was any misunderstanding in between, Fengze couldn't ask for more. He couldn't even leave at will now, because his master immortal Guyu had asked him to wait here. Fengze silently retreated and nodded to the two Taoist children. He stood under a pillar at the side of the hall entrance and frowned at the same time. After a while, he who was full of doubts suddenly thought of something. Could it be that Master's reaction was related to his purpose of coming? He had never heard of any enmity between him and immortal Taihu. Could it be that he had suddenly committed a taboo? Fengze's body trembled. He could not help but reach out and wipe his forehead. It was actually a little wet. At the same time, a similar scene of subordinates paying their respects to the true monarch also occurred in the Kunlun Palace on the other side of the celestial dragon mountain. The only difference was that the true monarch Tianlan, who was usually even more arrogant than the true monarch Guyu, didn't reject people outside the palace like the true monarch Guyu did. Instead, he allowed Shui Ying of the Floating Clouds office to speak with him. That oxen was lying lazily on one side and sleeping. Immortal Tianlan was sitting not far from oxen with a calm expression. He looked at the beautiful and charming woman who was kneeling on the ground not far in front of him. His eyes were as deep as the unfathomable sea, with faint waves rising and falling. Shuang, on the other hand, was kneeling on the ground and did not even raise her head. She only opened her mouth and said, "It is subordinate's incompetence that has troubled you." Immortal Tianlan looked at her quietly. After a while he said, "You don't have to explain so much to me. Elder Gui is a cunning and treacherous person. It is understandable that you could not catch him. I do not blame you." Shuang kowtowed and said, "Thank you for your understanding. It's just that junior brother Lu Chen asked me about this matter. I am afraid that I have delayed Immortal's important matter, so I have come to ask for forgiveness." Immortal Tianlan's eyes slightly drooped. There was a slight chill in his eyes, but it was gone in a flash. He said, "You have led Fuyunji for many years. You are powerful and meritorious." Only then did Shuang let out a sigh of relief. When Immortal Tianlan asked her to stand up, she climbed up from the ground and stood to the side. Immortal Tianlan looked at her and thought for a while. He said, "Lu Chen is still young. He has not done well in some things. You have to give him more guidance." Shuang hurriedly said, "Not at all. Junior brother Lu Chen is extremely intelligent and resolute. Even if he has a few flaws, they do not cover up his brilliance. It's not a big deal." Immortal Tianlan narrowed his eyes and did not say anything more. He said, "After you go out later, send someone to find Lu Chen and ask him to come see me." Hearing this, Shuang pursed her lips. She could not help but glance at Immortal Tianlan from the corner of her eyes. However, she saw that this lord's expression was cold and seemed to be a little angry. She immediately retracted her gaze and said respectfully, "Yes, I will send someone to find junior brother Lu Chen right now. I heard that he is on good terms with Su Qingjun of the Kunlun party. Today, Su Qingjun has left the city to return to Kunlun Mountain. I wonder if he will send her off. I'll go look for him." Immortal Tianlan did not say anything. Shuang did not dare to say anything else either. She bowed and walked out. When she was about to reach the door, Immortal Tianlan's voice suddenly sounded from behind. He said, "Even though there are many difficulties, we still have to capture Elder Gui. You have followed me for so many years. You should know that I don't care about the process most of the time. I only care about the results." Shui Ying's heart skipped a beat. She nodded in agreement and left quickly. Immortal Tianlan's expression gradually turned cold as he watched Shuang leave. Chapter 561. The news of Supreme Guyu attacking his disciple Feng Zhe was not known to the outside world for the time being, but it had begun to slowly spread within the Starry Hall. This news surprised many people, and they discussed it in private, but no one would stand up for him, because Feng Zhe was still punished to kneel outside the Starry Hall to beg for forgiveness. This matter actually happened not too long ago, and the outside world did not know about it because it was still a short time, and the news had not spread yet. However, for Fuyunji, which valued all kinds of information the most in Zhangxianmeng, and almost everywhere, they still got the news very quickly. In the past, such secret information involving the level of deity transformation was also a taboo in Fuyunji. Generally, when intelligence was handed over, it would only be passed to two people in the end. One was of course Supreme Tianlan, and the other was Shuang, who was in charge of Fuyunji. However, at present, after Supreme Tianlan personally confirmed it, there was one more person who could see the highest secret information, and that was Lu Chen. At this moment, Lu Chen received such a sealed envelope that was delivered by a special person. Before this, Old Ma was accompanying him to talk about something. After seeing the appearance of the letter, which basically had no extra traces on the surface, but the envelope was khaki and looked very old-fashioned, the expression on Old Ma's face immediately became serious. He took a few steps back and kept a distance from Lu Chen. Lu Chen glanced at Old Ma and nodded slightly. Without more hesitation, he directly tore open the seal and took out the letter to read. Old Ma looked at him from the side and saw that Lu Chen's face was calm. His eyes swept over the letter slightly, and from beginning to end, there was no change in his expression. After reading in silence, Lu Chen silently put the letter back into the envelope and held it in his hand. After a moment of silence, suddenly a flame rose from his hand and ignited the letter. Then it burned quickly, and soon the letter was burned to ashes. The ashes were blown by the wind, and suddenly flew into the sky and scattered on the ground, becoming part of the dust and soil, and could no longer be found. "Let's go," Lu Chen said to Old Ma. Old Ma nodded and walked over, walking side by side with Lu Chen, but from beginning to end, he did not ask a word. After walking for a while, Lu Chen suddenly asked Old Ma, "Are you familiar with the situation at Starry Hall?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "I know a little. What do you want to ask?" Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, "Just tell me casually. Although I have learned a little before, after all, I haven't been back for a long time, and most of my energy is in Fuyunji. There are many things that I can't take care of at the moment." Of course, it was not a whim of Lu Chen to suddenly ask about the situation at Starry Hall. Old Ma understood in his heart that most of the news in the secret letter was related to Starry Hall, and according to the level of the secret letter, it must also involve the news of immortal Guyu of Starry Hall. Those who had managed to survive in the Floating Clouds office to this day were not fools. Most of them were smart people. Old Ma quickly understood this matter. Then he thought about it on a deeper level. If he could think of this, how could Lu Chen not think of it? But Lu Chen still asked him very calmly. In fact, this was tantamount to telling him something tactfully, and it was also tantamount to expressing trust in him from another perspective. Old Ma bowed his head slightly, and there was some warmth in his heart. Then he decided to say everything he knew. Starry Hall has always been in a relatively detached position in the eyes of the major halls in Zhengxianmeng. In terms of strength and influence, the Starry Hall has never been prominent. Not to mention our Floating Clouds department, which is like the sun at high noon. Even compared to the Heavenly Law Hall and the Great Chancellor Courtyard, their prestige is still much smaller. However, after all, there is still immortal Guyu of Soul Formation in Starry Hall, and the other 5 immortals are also very respectful to immortal Guyu. So, although Starry Hall does not fight for big things, they also have a share in small things and some benefits that should be there. Their days are still quite good. Lu Chen nodded slightly and did not speak. Old Ma's words just now were actually relatively tactful, but for him who had begun to gradually understand the actual situation of Zhengxianmeng, he had already understood it after listening. The meaning of this sentence was that I have my own Starry Hall, and it doesn't matter if the rest of you want to dominate the mountains and silver seas. I will honestly watch and not block your path, but you have to give me, a immortal Guyu of Soul Formation, some face. After all, I am also known as one of the top 6 figures. There should be some benefits, right? So there was. It was really good for everyone, and it was best for everyone to have benefits. It was best for everyone that Zhengxianmeng could become more and more prosperous. Only a madman would break such a good thing. Was there such a madman who stood at the top in this world but went crazy? Well, there shouldn't be. Lu Chen shook his head slightly and smiled bitterly in his heart, but he did not show it on his face. He said to Old Ma, "I heard that immortal Guyu has several disciples. Usually, he only oversees the overall situation, but generally does not care about the trivial things under him?" Old Ma nodded and said, "That's right. Immortal Guyu has 5 disciples, all named with the word Feng. They usually work for him. Most of the time, it is enough for the 5 of them to appear in front of the Starry Hall. So in private, some people also jokingly call them the 5 guardian deities of the Starry Hall." Speaking of this, Old Ma laughed and said, "But there is another interesting thing, that is immortal Guyu usually has a detached attitude in the Immortal Alliance, but many times in the Immortal Alliance, there is a need to choose a side for the interests and various disputes in the Immortal Alliance. Although the 5 disciples have the same master, their positions and attitudes are very different when dealing with affairs. They are more inclined, which is also a scenery of our Sky Dragon Mountain." Lu Chen's eyes flashed slightly and said, "What do you mean?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "I heard that the 5 outstanding disciples of Immortal Guyu are actually in contact with other big mountain factions in private. Of course, there is no evidence for this, it is just speculation by others. But generally speaking, Immortal Guyu's eldest disciple, Fengze, is said to be inclined to the side of Heavenly Law Hall's immortal Taihu, because his Taoist companion is a Jin Dan female cultivator from Heavenly Law Hall. The second disciple, Feng Hen, is usually very close to our Fuyunji. The third disciple, Feng Wu, likes to interact with people from Dazai and the fourth and fifth disciples are also close to people from Golden Dragon Immortal and Luyan Immortal's side respectively. Lu Chen stopped his footsteps when he heard this. His face revealed a look of surprise and said in astonishment, "So obvious? Doesn't Immortal Guyu care about these disciples?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "Who knows, that is what everyone says. Maybe Immortal Guyu has the pearl of wisdom in his hands, and is too lazy to care about these small things." Lu Chen pondered for a moment and asked, "Then usually, which disciple does Immortal Guyu trust the most?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "I heard that the eldest disciple, Feng Zhe, is the most talented and capable. Immortal Guyu likes him the most." Lu Chen let out a ha sound and suddenly laughed, his face revealing a meaningful smile. Chapter 562. What do you mean? Looking at you. There seems to be something I don't know. Old Ma looked at Lu Chen and asked with a smile. Lu Chen waved his hand. He was about to speak but quickly shut his mouth. After a moment of silence, he changed the topic and said, "You just said that Guyu Perfected's second disciple Feng Hen is close to our Fuyunji side. Is he also married to someone like the eldest disciple Feng Zhe?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "I haven't heard of this. In fact, although Feng Zhe's Taoist companion is a female cultivator from the Heavenly Law Hall, she doesn't usually do anything excessive. After all, Feng Zhe is the disciple of a Huashan Perfected. It's just that with this layer of relationship, once there is something related to interests, Feng Zhe will naturally be biased towards the Heavenly Law Hall. This is also human nature." Speaking of this, Old Ma smiled and said, "But this is too much, and it is easy to be criticized. Look at the second disciple Feng Hen over there. He has nothing to do with our Fuyunji. Our means are still more clever." "Clever my ass." Lu Chen sneered and said, "Since you said it so directly, he is on our side. Obviously, the outside world probably thinks so too. In this case, what's the use of talking nonsense without clear evidence? Do you think that Guyu Perfected, a high and mighty Huashan Perfected, will care if you have evidence or not? There are many things in this world that need to be reasonable, and this is also the use of the so-called justice of heaven. However, there are also some people who are too powerful, such as Tianlan and Guyu. Generally speaking, if there is no evidence, then there is no evidence. It's just that he doesn't like you. If he really didn't like you, he could still kill you without any evidence. Even if he didn't do it because he had some scruples and didn't do it, it was definitely not because he was worried about something like reason or evidence. Instead, he felt that there would be all kinds of chain reactions after he did it. For example, his subordinates would become disloyal, worried, afraid, or have greater achievements to consider. What made them endure it was the most important thing. Of course, Old Ma also understood this, so he was a little embarrassed when he was ridiculed by Lu Chen. He smiled bitterly and said, "In fact, it's not necessarily true that he colluded with Fuyunji. It's nothing more than that he is biased towards us on some matters. To be honest, with Fuyunji's current reputation and the Starry Temple's recent achievements, we really don't need to curry favor with them." This was the truth, so Lu Chen nodded and admitted it. However, as long as he thought about the rumor that Guyu Perfected had accepted 5 disciples who actually colluded with the other 5 mountain forces of Zhengxianmeng, it was really an incredible thing. Moreover, apart from the Starry Temple, the other great deity Perfected subordinates had never encountered such a situation. Lu Chen's heart moved slightly, but he thought to himself that no one who could set foot in the Huashan realm was stupid. All of them were smart people. Even if they were not that shocking perverted lunatic like the Dambaldi, Lu Chen would not believe that any Huashan realm Perfected was not scheming enough. That Guyu Perfected could actually tolerate such a mess of his disciples, and could also tolerate the existence of such rumors that were actually a slap in his face. He always felt that it was unusual and seemed to have a deeper meaning. While thinking, Lu Chen suddenly heard Old Ma's question from the side. "What's the matter?" Lu Chen was startled and turned to look, only to see that old Ma had unknowingly taken 2 steps forward and stood in front of him, looking at a man walking on the road in front of him. Lu Qin glanced at the man and found that it was also a familiar face, but it was one of Shui Ying's trusted subordinates that he had seen in Fuyunji before. The man walked closer. His expression was calm, first bowed to Lu Qin, then said, "My hall master ordered me to find young Master Lu Qin, and to pass a message, that the Lord Perfected wants to see you. Please go to the Kunlun Temple as soon as possible." Old Ma turned to look at Lu Qin. Lu Qin also had a surprised expression on his face, but he quickly calmed down, nodded and said, "Okay, I will go immediately." The man smiled, bowed again, and went straight away. From beginning to end, he was polite, but in the eyes of Lu Qin and old Ma, there was a sense of alienation from him. After waiting for a while, when the man walked far away, Lu Qin suddenly said, "That man just now didn't like me, did he?" Old Ma rolled his eyes and said snappily, "How would I know? He was so polite to you, it's good enough. Look, he probably didn't even look at me." Lu Qin laughed, walked over and patted old Ma's shoulder, and the two turned and began to walk in the direction of the Kunlun Temple. There were some things that old Ma didn't say, and neither did Lu Qin, but they both understood. For the floating clouds division that was currently like the midday sun, the two of them could actually be considered lucky people. They were people who had suddenly soared up from the bottom of the hierarchy. Of course, there was also a difference between the two of them. After all, Lu Qin was chosen by perfected Lord Tianlan, and he was publicly accepted as a disciple. In the Fuyunji system, perfected Lord Tianlan had supreme authority, and everyone had to look up to him. So Lu Qin was forced to be respected. However, old Ma was different. He had no identity, no background, and his cultivation was not high. He had been in Fuyunji for many years, but he had never been famous, even though he had to live incognito to protect the secret of the shadow, Lu Qin. Nowadays, in the eyes of many people, old Ma relied on Lu Qin to climb up from a nobody. He had no ability and no credit, and he was always a follower of Lu Qin, enjoying a good life, but his status was still extremely high. It should be known that Lu Qin had a chance to inherit the entire foundation of perfected Lord Tianlan in the future, so the trusted follower of him was very unpleasant to the eyes. Lu Qin did not speak again, and old Ma did not complain anymore. They just walked forward together. Many years ago, when they were still in Qingshitang village, they looked like old friends who had a deep friendship and often joked with each other. However, on this day, as they walked together, old Ma had unknowingly become someone who was one step behind Lu Qin. They were silent, and no one spoke for a long time. They no longer looked like friends, but more like a boss and a subordinate. Or, to put it more bluntly and harshly, like a master and a servant. When did this happen, and when did it become like this? They walked in silence all the way, and finally, they reached the majestic Kunlun Hall. Lu Qin stopped, and old Ma quickly stopped behind him. Lu Qin did not turn back, but when he looked at the majestic hall in front of him, he suddenly said, "Someone is making things difficult for you?" "Not yet," said old Ma. "You sound like you're a little worried?" Old Ma said, "I'm not just worried, I'm scared to death." Lu Qin's body trembled slightly, and he finally turned back to look at him. Old Ma sighed and said, "I always feel that I can only be at ease when I'm with you every day. Other times, I don't even dare to sleep." The muscles on Lu Qin's face twitched slightly. Chapter 563. Has it already reached such a stage? Lu Qin asked old Ma. Old Ma said, "Maybe I'm thinking too much. After all, nothing has happened, and no one really hurt me. But if it's possible, why don't I leave a mortal city for a period of time?" Lu Qin was startled. He looked at old Ma and said, "You want to leave too?" Old Ma scratched his head and said, "I'm just going out to relax and get some fresh air. I'll be back after a while." Lu Qin stared at him for a long time. He suddenly sighed and said, "Looks like you really haven't slept well for a long time." Old Ma's smile was gone. He just shrugged and said, "It's good that you know." Lu Qin thought about it and said, "I don't object to you leaving. But I'll say it again. Since we've entered the immortal city's Vanity Fair, and under the influence of power, some things are not up to us to decide. Now that everyone knows that you're my man, and the most trusted one at that. If you leave a mortal city rashly, you'll naturally be targeted. There will also be people who suspect that you're not avoiding trouble, but that I've sent you to do some secret things. Old Ma's face looked a little bitter. Lu Chen said again, "You're also an old man in Fuyunji. I won't say these words, but I'm sure you know in your heart. With Fuyunji's power, once you're targeted by them, I'm afraid it'll be very difficult for you to leave a mortal city and live a carefree life." Old Ma gritted his teeth. He probably weighed the pros and cons in his heart. Then he revealed a dejected expression and said, "I think I probably can't escape, unless someone asks." When he said this, he stopped himself. His face revealed some apprehension as he glanced at Lu Chen. Lu Chen understood his meaning in that glance. He understood in his heart, but he did not feel too happy. His face still looked very calm, perhaps even a little dull. The person who could speak was not Lu Chen. Lu Chen knew this very well. He knew that he could not control Fuyunji. Of course, he could not order Fuyunji to let Old Ma go. Out of all the living beings in the world, only one person could do this. Both he and Old Ma knew who this person was. Both Old Ma and he knew very well who could speak in front of that person. He just stood there quietly and looked at him for a while, then nodded and said softly, "Wait here for a while, I'll go in and talk to that damn Baldy." After that, he turned around and strode towards the Kunlun temple. Old Ma stood where he was, watching Lu Chen's back as he gradually walked further and further away. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sense of desolation in his heart. He bowed his head slightly then sighed. There were thousands of people in the world, and everyone's fate was different. Perhaps some people were born perfect and would have a good life, but some people were unlucky, born lonely, and would always encounter all kinds of misfortunes. What kind of person would you be? Would you feel lonely occasionally? If in this long life, those who know familiar and important people, they will sooner or later leave, leaving you alone, then how will you feel? But no matter what, probably maybe we would not say it, pretend to be calm, pretend to face life calmly. When Lu Chen walked into the temple, he felt a sense of loss. It was not until Old Ma's hesitant words that he suddenly realized that he only had one friend left by his side. And now, that person seemed to be about to leave. He looked up and caught sight of perfected Lord Tianlan. That burly man had a handsome and resolute face and a big bald head that was incompatible with the image of the world's experts. But it did not weaken his power at all. He just sat there quietly. He did not sit on the high lotus throne, nor did he sit on those spacious, comfortable, and majestic big chairs with backrests. He sat cross-legged on the ground, his loose robe hanging down, like a god sitting peacefully in the mortal world, like a mountain overlooking the human world. There was no one around him. In the towering and magnificent temple, there was actually no one who could accompany him. It was empty and silent. Looking at this damn bald head, Lu Chen suddenly felt that he also seemed a little lonely for a moment. Perfected Lord Tianlan originally sat there quietly with his eyes fixed on an unknown place, as if he was daydreaming. However, when Lu Chen walked in, he seemed to wake up in an instant. His eyes swept to the entrance of the temple, and then he revealed a smile that Lu Chen was familiar with. He waved at him from afar and said, "Come here." Whenever there was an important occasion, or when there were outsiders present, Lu Chen and perfected Lord Tianlan would be very well-behaved and well-behaved. However, when there was no one around and the two of them were alone, Lu Chen would often become very casual, and perfected Lord Tianlan did not seem to care about it. He had always liked and even indulged his disciple, Lu Chen. There were times when many of his subordinates were puzzled by this love and affection. Some even found it hard to believe, such as Blood Warbler, Fuyanxi, and even Old Ma, and perhaps Lu Chen himself. Lu Chen walked straight to perfected Lord Tianlan, and did not stop until he was a few feet away from him. Smiling, perfected Lord Tianlan pointed to the ground and said gently, "Sit down." Looking at his body, Lu Chen suddenly had a somewhat nasty guess. He thought, could it be that this damn bald head is too fat and heavy, and the chair will collapse if he sits on it? That's why he likes to sit on the ground. Of course, this idea was simply nonsense and not worth refuting. Even Lu Chen did not believe it at all. As a dignified perfected lord of the divine transformation realm, there was nothing he couldn't do. Why would he have such concerns? However, Lu Chen seemed to have some irrepressible impulse, or an inexplicable feeling in his heart today. He just liked to think this way. Of course, on the surface, he still sat down very calmly. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. When he was about to say something, he glanced at Lu Chen's calm face and suddenly paused. Then a trace of surprise flashed across his face, but he changed his tone and asked, "What's wrong? You seem to be in a bad mood today?" Although Lu Chen had long known that the damned Baldy was omnipotent and almost omnipotent, he still felt as if he could see through people's minds with just a glance. Lu Chen still felt his heart churning. Then he suddenly felt a little annoyed. Instead of answering Perfected Lord Tianlan's question, he frowned and asked, "Hey, can I ask you something?" Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his eyebrows, but with some curiosity and a faint smile, he said indifferently, "Sure, go ahead." Just as he straightened his back and sorted out his emotions, ready to answer his closest disciple, who was also his most rebellious person, and what kind of strange, inexplicable, or even earth-shattering question he heard Lu Chen say, "How have you been recently?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment. At that moment, his mood was very complicated. It should be noted that he had been prepared to face difficulties, and even thought about how he should respond when Lu Chen asked all kinds of tricky and difficult questions, and even his deepest secrets. However, he did not expect that he would hear such an ordinary question. "How have you been recently?" Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted, and looked a little displeased. But suddenly his eyes flickered. How could he be so easily fooled given his intellect, his unparalleled wisdom, and his astounding talent and strategy? How could this question be so simple? Perfected Lord Tianlan calmed down and thought about it carefully. Then he asked Lu Chen cautiously, "What did you mean by the standard of living well?" Lu Chen was speechless and dumbfounded. Chapter 564. It took Lu Chen quite a while to calm himself down. Then he carefully considered his words. In the end, he said to Perfected Lord Tianlan with some uncertainty and a bit of a probing tone, "Perhaps, you're having a good time recently? Do you feel very happy?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment. Then he realized that he had probably overreacted. This rebellious disciple of his did not seem to have any weird thoughts just now. Instead, he had asked the most ordinary question. He had thought too much. The atmosphere was a little awkward. However, there was a saying that true experts did not have awkwardness. Even if they did, they could throw it to others. Therefore, Perfected Lord Tianlan said very calmly, "Oh, that should be okay." "Okay. You mean that you're having a good time and are very happy?" Lu Chen actually asked again. Perfected Lord Tianlan was a little impatient. However, he always seemed to have a special endurance when facing Lu Chen. Therefore, he actually thought about it again. As a result, he actually thought about it for quite a while, and a look of hesitation appeared on his face. After a while, he frowned and said to Lu Chen seriously, "I didn't think so at first. However, now that you've asked me this question, I think I really don't feel that kind of especially comfortable and happy feeling. Perhaps I'm just living my life peacefully." He nodded and said to Lu Chen, "It seems that I'm not having a good time." Lu Chen rolled his eyes. The indescribable anger that had been surging in his heart suddenly disappeared at this moment. He only felt a little helpless. Shaking his head, he sighed and said, "Forget it, I won't talk about it anymore. Why did you call me here?" Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with interest. "Well, I did call you here because I have something important to tell you." Lu Chen's expression turned serious. He also sat up a little straighter, and his expression became serious. Unexpectedly, Perfected Lord Tianlan continued, "But let's put that aside first. Tell me, why did you suddenly come in and ask that question?" Lu Chen was stunned. "Didn't you say that you had something important to tell me?" "Yeah. If it's urgent, then why didn't you say it? You actually asked me that boring question just now." Perfected Lord Tianlan said disapprovingly, "No matter how important it is, I can handle it. What's there to be afraid of? Come. I see that you are a little strange today. You are very different from your usual self. This is very rare. Tell me about it." Towards the end, he seemed to be overflowing with interest. Looking at the damn baldy in front of him, Lucien suddenly had a strange feeling of absurdity. Could it be that this damn baldy really also felt lonely? Thinking back, he was usually so high and mighty that it was impossible for anyone to get close to him. Only he, who had always been rebellious, could casually say a few words to him. Lucien didn't think about it anymore. After a moment of silence, he said, "It's nothing. I just feel that life has been boring recently. Sometimes, I don't even have someone to talk to. Maybe I feel lonely?" Perfected Lord Tianlong glared at Lucien, causing Lucien to feel goosebumps. He could not help but ask angrily, "What are you staring at me for?" Suddenly, Perfected Lord Tianlong burst into laughter and pointed at him. "To think that you would have such a melancholic moment. What a joke, what a joke." Lucien rolled his eyes. He couldn't be bothered to argue, so he didn't say a word. Perfected Lord Tianlong laughed for a while before smiling at Lucien. "Don't talk nonsense. Back then, you hid in a fiend cult for 10 years. Back then, was there anyone who could tell you the truth? Didn't you still survive just like that?" Lucien thought for a moment. "You're right." Perfected Lord Tianlong smiled. "Right." Lucien replied, "It's probably because I've experienced it that I'm especially afraid of living those days again." Perfected Lord Tianlong's smile faded slightly. A moment later he asked softly, "Are you still blaming me?" Lucien shook his head. "No, I'm just expressing my feelings. I don't dare to say it in front of others, but I'm just complaining in front of you. Is that all right?" Perfected Lord Tianlong smiled. It's fine." Lucien sighed. "These days are unbearable. It's as though I'm always seeing people leaving and dying. By the way, damned baldy, you're often alone as well. Have you ever felt lonely?" Perfected Lord Tianlong smiled and shook his head. Just as he was about to reply, he froze all of a sudden and fell silent. For a moment he was speechless. Lucien sensed something and looked up in surprise. He saw that the smile on Perfected Lord Tianlong's face was gone, and he gradually regained his original solemn expression. He was like a god and did not seem to have the emotions and desires of a human. Was he lonely? Apart from himself, no one knew the answer to that question because he was the only one who could experience that feeling. Therefore, if Perfected Lord Tianlong did not say anything, Lucien would not understand how he felt. Even though he had many guesses from Perfected Lord Tianlong's expressions and actions, they were ultimately just guesses. However, for some reason, Lucien suddenly felt that this damned baldy was more pleasing to the eye. When Perfected Lord Tianlong retracted his smile and was solemn, he was rather dignified and everyone on Sky Dragon Mountain respected him. However, when he saw Lucien looking at him with a strange expression, he frowned. Then he suddenly said with some dissatisfaction, "What are you looking at with shifty eyes?" Lucien said, "Is it wrong for me to look at you and listen to you?" Perfected Lord Tianlong scoffed. "I'm a soul formation Perfected Lord. Is it wrong for me to say that you're wrong?" Lucien was stunned for a while before nodding. "You're right, it's all my fault." Perfected Lord Tianlong looked at him, and the serious expression on his face suddenly disappeared. He laughed and slapped his knee. "You're quite sensible." Lucien rolled his eyes, and then he sighed and said, "All right, the two of us have some status on Heavenly Dragon Mountain at any rate. What exactly do you want to talk to me about after we've wasted so much time talking nonsense?" Perfected Lord Tianlong scoffed. "You're the one who started all this nonsense. However, this is good. I'm in a good mood after talking about it. I feel like I'm living a happy life now." Lucien was speechless. He thought that no one would expect such a Perfected Lord Tianlong to be like this. However, seeing that the damn baldy was just sitting there happily without any intention to continue talking, Lucien could only remind him to talk about business again. Perfected Lord Tianlong replied with a no, as if he was reminded of that matter. He said casually, "I called you here to ask you, what have you been doing recently?" Lucien said, "I didn't do much. The devil cult side is basically fine. Only Elder Ghost escaped, so I helped Shuang chase after him." "Don't bother about that matter." Perfected Lord Tianlong suddenly interrupted him. "Don't interfere in this matter in the future. Leave it to Shuang. Lu Chen was stunned. It was not that he was reluctant to give up that bit of power, but he was surprised that perfected Lord Tianlan was so resolute. After a pause, he did not ask for the reason and agreed immediately. All right. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression relaxed when he saw Lu Chen's reaction. He smiled and nodded. All right, that's all. You can go now. Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. That's all. Yes, that's all. That's all. Lu Chen said. All right, but I still have something to tell you. Chapter 565. What's the matter? Perfected Lord Tianlan asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, There's still some trouble in the western land. I want old Ma to go there. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and looked at Lu Chen without saying anything, but his eyes were deep and sharp as if he wanted to see through Lu Chen's mind. Lu Chen didn't intend to avoid his eyes and just met his eyes. After a while, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly snorted and said, No. Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but then stopped. In the end, he just nodded without saying anything, and there was no shame or anger on his face after his request was rejected. When Lu Chen walked out of the Kunlun Palace, the moment he stepped out of the door, his originally calm face was replaced by a heavy graveness, as if he had a lot on his mind. Old Ma, who had been waiting outside, came to greet him. First, he carefully looked at Lu Chen's expression, and his heart skipped a beat. Then he looked at the magnificent palace behind Lu Chen and asked in a low voice, How is it? Lu Chen shook his head slightly and didn't answer. He only said softly, Let's walk and talk. Old Ma was stunned and nodded in agreement. Then, he followed Lu Chen and left the Kunlun Palace. After walking for more than 100 feet, Lu Chen stopped and said to Old Ma, You can't leave without my agreement. Old Ma looked disappointed, but he didn't look particularly surprised. Maybe he already knew it. But even so, he still sighed and muttered a sentence. Lu Chen didn't hear him clearly and didn't know if he was complaining. After a while, Old Ma gradually calmed down and asked Lu Chen with a frown, Why? Lu Chen shook his head and said, No reason. He didn't explain. He just said no directly. Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, Then forget it. Nothing will happen here in the immortal city. Even if the sky falls, there are so many people on Mount Tianlong to support it. Lu Chen laughed and patted his old friend's shoulder saying, You're right. Don't be afraid. If something really happens, there are people more unfortunate than you. Old Ma shrugged and didn't seem to take Lu Chen's words to heart. He looked around casually and suddenly changed the topic saying, By the way, why didn't I see Atsu today? Isn't it always with you? Lu Chen said with an O and said, Didn't the oxen on Kunlun Mountain also come here? Recently, Atsu often follows it when it has nothing to do. I don't know where it is now. The atmosphere on the mountain recently feels a little strange. An aged but calm voice floated in the quiet room. That hand that already seemed a bit withered was currently placed on a smooth, spotlessly white, and exquisite woman's back, gently caressing it. Song Wenji turned sideways and faced the inside of the wall. The flush on her face had mostly faded, and the remaining blush was like two groups of rouge smeared on her charming and beautiful cheeks, exuding a breathtaking temptation. But she seemed to have no intention of showing this beauty to others. She was only pretending to be tired and quietly looking at the cold and hard wall in front of her. At this time, her face revealed a rare trace of coldness. The old hand touched her bare shoulder and gently rubbed it. It was like a piece of hard and rough sandpaper, making Song Wenji's whole body tremble slightly. Her heart felt numb, and a trace of deep and dark disgust flashed across the depths of her eyes. The hand suddenly stopped, and then the voice paused for a moment. Then with a trace of concern he asked her, What's wrong? The coldness on Song Wenji's face vanished in an instant, and was replaced by a languid coquettishness with a little shyness. She gently turned over and smiled like a blooming spring flower, beautiful beyond words. She said, I'm fine, foster father. Of course, the person behind her was immortal Tiehu from the Hall of Heavenly Law. With some affection, he gently stroked Song Wenji's beautiful hair. His face showed a gratified expression and said, It's good that you're fine. Song Wonji smiled and said, I was distracted just now. Ifu, what did you say just now? Immortal Tiehu said, I said that recently. I feel that the atmosphere here on the mountain is a little strange. I always feel that something is going to happen. He hesitated for a moment and said, Oh yes, I heard that in the Starry Hall, Fengze was scolded and punished by that old man Guyu and has been kneeling outside the hall for a few days. Song Wenji nodded and said, It's true. I also heard about it and specially sent people to inquire about it in private. But now everyone in the Starry Hall says that Fengze, for some reason, suddenly angered Immortal Guyu, and was then punished severely by Immortal Guyu. He did not care about senior brother Fengze's face at all. You should know that senior brother Fengze is the eldest disciple of Immortal Guyu, and is usually the most valued. Everyone thinks that he is the most promising person to inherit Immortal Guyu's mantle. Immortal Tiehu snorted and said, It's hard to say whether he can become Guyu's true disciple, and take over the foundation of the Starry Hall. But with old Guyu suddenly doing this, it's hard to say whether he is targeting our Heavenly Law Hall. Song Wenji frowned and said, It can't be. Immortal Tiehu thought for a while and seemed to have no clue, so he changed the topic and said, That kid from the Kunlun party called Hei. Has there been any progress recently? Song Wenji's eyes flashed and said, That person is in a hurry and kept asking me to make arrangements. He wants to meet you personally. Immortal Tiehu sneered and said, Have you checked his background? Is there anything suspicious? Song Wenji quickly nodded and said, I have. This Hei is indeed a direct disciple of the Kunlun party, and is also one of the most outstanding people in the younger generation of the Kunlun party in the past few years. But a few years ago, after the chaos of the full moon in the Kunlun party, his teacher Dukan Jinren died accidentally. Although he quickly went to Immortal Tianlan's side, I heard that he spared no effort in doing things for Immortal Tianlan. But until now, I haven't heard that Immortal Tianlan really has the intention to promote him. Immortal Tiehu sneered and said, He's just a clown. What kind of person is Tianlan? Why would he like him? Song Wenji raised her eyebrows slightly. Then, foster father, are you saying that he's depressed because he can't get what he wants? That's why he's secretly relying on us. Immortal Tiehu thought for a moment and said, It has been difficult for us to get a nail in Fuyunji and the Kunlun party. Although we can't completely trust Hei this time, it is a rare opportunity after all. How about this? He suddenly sat up and squinted his eyes with a hint of coldness and said, Let him prepare a proof of allegiance. If he is sincere, I will meet him and guarantee him a bright future. Proof of allegiance? What is it? Song Wenji's eyes flashed and asked in a low voice. Immortal Tiehu sneered and said, He naturally knows. Chapter 566. Indeed, Atsu did not follow Luchin for the past few days. In the eyes of the black dog, it was usually protecting this good-for-nothing. At the same time, it took some of its favorite monster meat from Luchen's hands, or the mysterious tree hole as a form of reward. Of course, the most important thing was that Luchen had protected it back then. It was Sir Atsu who cherished old friendships that led it to protect Luchen. However, even though Atsu's strength had greatly increased after its transformation into a holy beast, it had to admit that although Luchen did not seem to have changed much on the surface, he gave off a different vibe than before. It was probably a very intimidating vibe. Ordinary people, even people like Old Ma, who were close to Luchen, would not notice this. It was only in front of Atsu that Luchen would sometimes let down his guard a little and reveal that slightly terrifying aura. Atsu was no stranger to that kind of aura. It had felt that murderous aura several times before. On some nights when it woke up in the middle of the night, it would suddenly feel that Luchen and itself were two burning flames, dark blazing flames. That kind of aura was very dangerous. If it got too close, it might be sucked into it and burned to pieces. It was terrifying. However, Atsu was not afraid of this, because it felt that its connection with Luchen had become closer. However, occasionally, it would also notice that it seemed to suddenly have a kind of bloodthirsty and murderous thoughts. When it saw a weak animal or beast, it would want to tear it apart and drink its blood, but it had no interest in meat. Atsu did not like this idea, and it even felt a little disgusted. Fortunately, each time this feeling appeared, it was very short, and every time, Atsu would quickly wake up. It could not speak, and it could not express itself. It could not explain it clearly to Lu Chun, and it was not very willing to. Atsu felt that although Lu Chun used to look quite smart, it seemed to be smarter than him now. If he couldn't figure it out, Lu Chun wouldn't be able to do anything about it, so he had to think of another way. That was why Atsu had left Lu Chun behind for the past few days. Lu Chun's strength had probably increased by quite a bit in secret, so protecting himself wouldn't be a problem. Atsu, on the other hand, had more important things to do. It was not only for itself, but also for Lu Chun. That guy was so stupid, and with the black fire, he must have the same problem as itself. It had to find a solution and a way out for the two of them. Well, before going to Kunlun Mountain, Atsu actually couldn't come up with any good ideas after thinking for a long time. Until now, the oxen that had been hiding in the depths of Kunlun Mountain suddenly followed them to the Immortal City. This was the first time Lu Chun and the black dog saw oxen appear on Mount Celestial Dragon. They had never seen it before, so they naturally thought that this was the first time this extraordinary spirit beast had come to Mount Celestial Dragon. However, this was not the case. The truth was that oxen had come to Mount Celestial Dragon many years ago, even earlier than Supreme Lord Tianlan. However, after that, oxen hated this place, and after leaving it was never willing to return. Except this time. Supreme Lord Tianlan was the only person in this world who knew the secret and those dusty stories, so it could be said that he was moved by oxen's visit this time, and he was even more grateful. Correspondingly, he quickly and decisively announced to the top of this mountain that he viewed this oxen in a different light. Both openly and secretly he made his attitude known. You can mess with me, but if you dare to mess with this oxen, you're dead meat. Well, of course, to be honest, he was just saying it. Of course, oxen couldn't be messed with, and this seemingly polite divine transformation stage supreme definitely couldn't be messed with either. Whoever messed with him would have a short life. In short, overnight, oxen received the transcendent treatment that it used to receive on Mount Kunlun Mountain. Even more so, back on Mount Kunlun Mountain, most of the disciples of the Kunlun party knew that this bull was Supreme Lord Tianlan's pet, and they loved it very much. However, when they met it, they would occasionally make fun of it, and those who were closer to it would go up and touch it, or say a few words to tease it. It was nothing. However, on the top of Mount Sky Dragon, the people of Zhangxianmeng, including those of Fuyunji, all became respectful of this oxen after Supreme Lord Tianlan made his attitude clear, and then kept a respectful distance from it. Perhaps it was also because the atmosphere here was getting more and more tense secretly. Therefore, in this strange situation, oxen suddenly found that apart from Supreme Lord Tianlan, the only one on the entire Mount Sky Dragon that dared to approach it was a dog. Well, actually, oxen didn't care about this situation. There were so many people on the entire Mount Sky Dragon, and even though there were several divine transformation stage Supreme Lords, it really didn't care about anyone except Supreme Lord Tianlan. Well, maybe Lu Chun could barely be counted as an exception. Black dog, black dog. At least this dog named Atsu looked good. In terms of seniority, it was a good dog that had come to its side when it was on Mount Kunlun, and it was a good dog that had good eyesight and was eager to be its follower. As a result, oxen's attitude toward black dog improved. Most of the time, it would stay in the Kunlun Palace and sleep. Atsu would also come to accompany it, but it didn't dare to enter the palace because it had been kicked out by Supreme Lord Tianlan before. Atsu was very smart. It knew who it should be afraid of, and who it shouldn't be afraid of. For example, it wasn't afraid of Lu Chun at all, because it knew that Lu Chun was good to it. Even if Lu Chun scolded it on a daily basis, he wouldn't harm it. However, that damn Baldy was different. If it angered him, he might really trample it to death. Oxen quickly sensed this, so it started to walk out of the palace. Then it calmly brought Black Dog around Mount Tianlong. The people on Mount Zhangxianmeng all retreated. Often, a cow and a dog could be seen walking on the main road, while a group of people hid by the roadside and looked at them curiously. Oxen turned a blind eye to this, and Atsu was very happy. It felt very cool. Then Atsu didn't have enough composure, so it laughed and expressed it. Oxen was very disdainful of this, but it didn't care. Later, it started to walk down Mount Tianlong with Atsu and wander around Immortal City. Oxen and Black Dog's body shape was very eye-catching and prominent. At first glance, it was obvious that they weren't ordinary water buffaloes and native dogs. Their skin color, their body shape, and their spirit. It was obvious that they were either spirit beasts or rare spiritual creatures. If they were captured, they would be worth a lot of money. Therefore, it instantly attracted the attention of countless people, and many people made a move. A small half of these people were crushed and killed by Oxen and Atsu, while the other half were killed by the people of Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji, who were full of disdain and contempt. Most of the time they would even curse. Spirit beasts who dare to strut around on the streets of Immortal City like this. How dare you have the guts to have evil thoughts? What he said made a lot of sense. Beasts were stronger than humans. This reality was quickly accepted and acknowledged by everyone. Then, when Oxen and Atsu walked on the streets, no one dared to stop them anymore. Instead, everyone hid far away. Until one day, when Oxen and Atsu walked on a long street, Atsu was chewing on a meat bone that it had picked up from God knows where, when it saw Oxen suddenly stop in its tracks. Atsu looked out in surprise, and saw a place in front of them that was surrounded by layers of cloth. Oxen looked at that place, and it was rare for him to be silent for a long time. Then, it suddenly took a step forward and walked behind the curtain. In a secluded corner of the street, a pair of bright and clear eyes looked at Oxen's back, and a trace of coldness flashed across its eyes. Chapter 567. Of course, there were guards around the curtain. Although this place was not conspicuous and the secret was well kept, not many outsiders knew about it. However, the thing below was too important, so many people were sent to watch over it. The guards stationed here were, of course, people from Zhengxianmeng. Most of them were from Fuyunji, and a small number were from Starry Hall. The reason for this arrangement was, of course, that the leadership of the mysterious underground cave city had fallen into the hands of the two Zhengxianmeng forces. As the most popular animals in Tianlong Mountain and Zhengxianmeng in recent days, Oxen and Black Dog were already quite famous. The guards standing here also had to change shifts to go up the mountain. After a while, of course, they were very clear about the origin of this cow and dog. At this time, everyone was a little dumbfounded. Not to mention in the Immortal City, even on Tianlong Mountain where the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng was located, these two spirit beasts almost strolled everywhere, and no one was nosy enough to stop them. Of course, unless it was some serious places, such as the cave residences of several deity transformation stage perfected cultivators, or the important places of several mountain halls. This kind of place was not allowed. However, it was hard to say for Atsu, but Oxen seemed to be a giant beast that had become a spirit. It never went near places that were taboo and places that might have powerful figures such as deity transformation stage perfected cultivators. Because of this, they didn't go to important places, and people would certainly give face to perfected Lord Tianlan and Fuyunji, so they wouldn't stop them. But this time, it seemed to be a little different. Regardless of whether it was the guards of the Floating Clouds Division or the Starry Hall, as long as they were guarding this place, they had been warned sternly by their superiors before they came that the underground tunnel was an extremely important place, and they had to guard it with all their might. They could not be careless. And they had indeed achieved this. Although there were many problems in Zhengxianmeng today, such as overstaffing, extravagance and exaggeration, and evading responsibility, it was still a hegemon of a generation. It had a solid foundation, and it was still possible for its subordinates to take things seriously. However, the situation they were in right now was a little troublesome. Seeing that Oxen and the Black Dog seemed to be very determined to walk into the curtain, the group of guards looked at each other. The people of Fuyunji looked at the guards of Starry Hall, and the people of Starry Hall looked at the experts of Fuyunji with hope. Then everyone realized that there was nothing they could do. In the end, someone from the Starry Hall shouted, "Hey, can you guys from Fuyunji block them?" There were many people on Fuyunji's side. Soon someone replied, "Why? Why aren't you guys attacking?" The guard of the Starry Hall actually laughed. He seemed to be taking pleasure in their misfortune. He said, "These two bastards came from your floating clouds office, right?" The guards of Fuyunji were instantly speechless. Oxen was perfected Lord Tianlan's spiritual beast, and the black dog was the pet of perfected Lord Tianlan's only disciple, Lu Chen. Needless to say, the master and disciple's status was high, but they both liked to keep pets. This was something that could not be refuted. Helpless, when they saw the people from the Starry Hall retreating, the guards from the Floating Clouds Agency had no choice but to walk over. About 10 of them lined up in a row and formed a human wall, blocking the green bull and Atu's path. The green ox looked up and stopped in his tracks. Atu poked his head out from behind it to take a look, and was instantly a little angry. This fellow had recently been used to being arrogant with the green ox, and this was the first time he saw someone daring to block his way. He jumped out, bared his snow-white fangs, and roared at the person in front of him, baring his teeth in a fierce manner. Roar. His meaning could not be more obvious. "You blind people, get out of our way. Don't block our Lord Ox and Lord Dog from taking a stroll." The guards of the Floating Clouds Agency all had bitter expressions on their faces. One of them lowered his voice and whispered, "I say, this is Lord True Immortal's spiritual beast. Isn't it extremely powerful? If it gets angry, won't we be in trouble?" When the people next to them heard this, their expressions became even worse. This situation could be said to be the worst. It was even worse than when perfected Lord Tianlan's disciple, Lu Chen, brought people over to stop them. Although Lu Chen's status was extremely high, he was still a human, and humans had to be reasonable, right? As long as they clearly explained the rules here, and everyone followed the rules, even Lu Chen could not do anything to them. But it was very annoying to deal with this ox and dog. If the spiritual beast in front of them got angry and rushed over to kill people, how would that end up? That was perfected Lord Tianlan's most beloved pet. Would anyone dare to reason with perfected Lord Tianlan? And even if perfected Lord Tianlan was reasonable, he would at most comfort them with kind words and give them some compensation. He would not really kill oxen to pay for it. If that happened, the dead would not be resurrected, and they would have died in vain. They were all people in Zhangxianmeng. Who didn't know this? Even small fries had their own intelligence and wit. Thus, no one dared to go up and criticize her sternly. This was a forbidden area, and she didn't allow them to wander around. However, it wasn't good for them to give way. Otherwise, if they were to be held accountable, Hall Master Xue Ying would definitely have to bear the consequences. After a while, Oxen became a little impatient. Black Dog saw that no one was paying attention to it, and immediately became angry. Did dogs not care about their reputation? Especially when there was an enigmatic boss, Oxen, behind it. Atsu bared its fangs and roared. It began to press forward with a very fierce momentum. It seemed like it was about to eat someone. The guards in Fuyunji were in an uproar. This black dog did not look like much on normal days, but when it suddenly became fierce, its momentum was very fierce and frightening. It was as if it was going to pounce on them and bite their throats in the next moment. There were a few sounds of pa 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 pa. 3 or 4 people pulled out their weapons at the same time. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Even the people from the Starry Hall who were watching from the sidelines stopped smiling and had solemn expressions on their faces. The guard duty here was very important. If something really happened, even if they were not the main responsibility, they would most likely be scolded or even punished. Atsu was not afraid of those weapons. It still slowly moved forward step by step. It was half testing and half pressuring. At the same time, a strange black flame flashed in the depths of its eyes. Just when the atmosphere suddenly became so tense that it made people hold their breath, they heard a low moo. Oxen appeared next to Atsu and blocked its way. Atsu glanced at Oxen and put away its fangs. The threatening momentum disappeared, and the guards in front of them immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, Oxen raised its head and walked forward without saying a word. The guards only saw a blur in front of them, and the huge body of the bull was in front of them in an instant. The guards were shocked and were about to shout for it to stop when they suddenly saw the green ox shake its head. With a scream, the guard who was closest to the ox's head suddenly rose into the air, and then flew into the distance with a strange cry. With a bang, he smashed into a piece of cloth, and then tore off 3 or 4 pieces of cloth at the side. Immediately, the ground was a mess. Dang dang. The group of guards suddenly stood up with a dignified look on their faces. They unsheathed their weapons and surrounded the cow and dog. Chapter 568. Everyone present was shocked. When the figure flew into the sky, everyone's gaze followed it, then turned their heads at the same time. They watched as the flying figure drew an arc in midair, then fell to the side of the curtain with a loud noise. A pile of things were torn off, revealing half of the tunnel entrance that was originally covered. Atsu poked its head out from behind Oxen's huge body and blinked its doggy eyes. It looked at this silent big guy with a look of admiration. It seemed like it really had a lot to learn. I seem to have heard Lu Chen say something like, "A dog that bites doesn't bark?" However, Atu immediately felt that something wasn't quite right. Lu Chen's words seemed to be cursing someone. For a moment, the dog's mind wandered, and it began to recall the situation when Lu Chen said those words to it. Was it a sarcastic curse? After all, this person was too bad. He was full of bad ideas and would often be tricked. It was better to be careful. Not to mention the fact that Atsu actually dared to be distracted at this critical moment. The guards in front were in an uproar. They immediately pulled out their weapons and surrounded the 2 spirit beasts. However, they could only surround the 2 spiritual beasts. Although the weapons were extremely sharp and flashed with a cold light, none of the menacing guards dared to make a move against the 2 spiritual beasts. Beasts were stronger than humans. Was this the situation? Oxen seemed to turn a blind eye to the people in front of it. At this moment, its big bell-like eyes were looking at the secret underground entrance that was half exposed, and a strange light seemed to flash across its eyes. Then, without any hesitation, it lifted its foot and walked toward the entrance of the tunnel. Oxen's body was originally extremely huge. Although it had been silent, its aura was very intimidating. As it walked forward, the 5 or 6 human guards in front of it suddenly felt as if a small mountain was pressing down on them. Even their breathing became a little nervous. But at this critical moment, Oxen suddenly stopped and turned back to take a look. The pressure was instantly relieved, and the few of them let out a long sigh of relief. Just when they thought that the situation had taken a turn for the better, they noticed that Oxen had turned around to glare at the black dog, who was standing there in a daze for some reason. With a swing of its tail, it smacked the black dog's head. Atu was startled and woke up. He turned his head to look around, and immediately felt a little embarrassed. He barked twice and trotted over. At the same time, he felt a little strange. In the past, he would never be in a daze at a time like this. What was going on today? Could it be that this oxen is too powerful, and I feel very safe, so I don't have any scruples? He had never felt this way before, even when he was with Lu Chen. Atsu glanced at Oxen and thought to himself, "I'll have to hold on to this big bull leg in the future." Oxen woke up Atsu. Although it was a little dissatisfied, it didn't seem to be very angry. It turned back and walked forward again. The few guards' faces suddenly became bitter again. However, things had already come to this point, and they couldn't back down anymore. They looked at each other with a dignified expression, but each of them had already mobilized their spiritual power. Their weapons and magic weapons gradually lit up. This meant that they were going to fight to the death. Seeing these few Fuyunji people acting like this, the people next to them also suddenly became gloomy. No one shouted. All the Fuyunji people quickly moved, and a murderous aura rose around them. This time around, there was no longer any panic or apprehension. Instead, it was filled with a bloody aura. This was the characteristic of Fuyunji for many years, and it was cultivated from the sea of blood. In a place further away, the people from Starry Hall were originally gloating, but at this time they suddenly felt this aura, and they instantly quieted down. One of the people in the lead hesitated for a moment, but he lowered his head and said something to the people next to him. Then he turned around and rushed in the direction of Mount Tianlong in the distance. Oxen and the black dog were both spiritual beasts with keen senses, so of course, it was impossible for them not to feel this aura. Atsu was the first to stop. If dogs could frown, this black dog would be frowning right now. It was willing to wander around with oxen, but after all, it had already gained spirituality and knew Lu Chen's position in Zhengxianmeng. To put it bluntly, these people were very likely to be Lu Chen's subordinates in the future. It didn't matter if they bullied them occasionally, but it was completely different to fight or even kill them. Atsu instantly wanted to retreat, and it barked at Oxen. However, Oxen, who was usually very lazy, was unusually persistent today for some reason. It seemed that it was determined to go to the secret passage. It turned a deaf ear to Atsu's barking. After pausing for a moment, it continued to move forward. Atsu was dumbfounded, but it couldn't just stand there, so it had to reluctantly follow. The people on the other side were waiting. As the two sides gradually approached each other, the street was silent. The situation was still tense, and a battle was about to break out. At this unusually tense moment, someone suddenly coughed behind the street, and then someone scolded, "Stupid dog, what are you doing over there? Hurry up and come over." Oxen stopped, and Atsu instantly turned around. Then it saw Lu Chen and Old Ma walking over from the street. Their faces were very serious, and they seemed a little angry. Atsu let out a loud bark, and then it ran towards Lu Chen, wagging its tail vigorously along the way. No one knew why it was so happy. Lu Chen snorted, and then he patted the head of the dog that had rushed in front of him, and said in a low voice, "Stupid dog, you only know how to make trouble for me." Atsu seemed to not understand what he said, and it only grinned and wagged its tail. Lu Chen coughed, and then he walked towards Oxen. Oxen stared at him, and its eyes were deep, and it seemed to be a little gloomy. As for the surrounding guards who were nervously holding weapons in their hands, they still looked very stern, and none of them had any intention of putting down the magic weapons in their hands. Lu Chen walked to Oxen's side and said in a low voice, "I say the people here are all the damn Baldi's subordinates. Don't do anything stupid." Oxen let out a low moo, but it didn't say anything. Lu Chen looked ahead again and he frowned and said, "You want to go down?" This time Oxen nodded. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then he waved his hand to call the guard in front of him, and said with a serious expression, "Do I have the right to go down?" The guard nodded. Lu Chen was perfected Lord Tianlan's disciple, and he was the one who discovered and destroyed the devil cult's lair. So he was definitely one of the few who had the right to go down. Lu Chen said, "Okay, then I'll go down now, and I'll bring these two to have a look." As he said that, he smiled and said, "You don't think that they'll leak the secret, do you?" It was hard to say, since they were spirit beasts, but one of them was perfected Lord Tianlan, and the other was Lu Chen's, so the possibility of them leaking the secret was not high. Moreover, Lu Chen had said it himself, so it could be considered as giving everyone a way out. Therefore, everyone made way, and Lu Chen brought Oxen and the black dog down. Behind them, Old Ma also walked forward, but he was stopped by the guards who said, "You can't go in." Old Ma was annoyed, and he pointed at the figures in front of him, and said angrily, "I'm not as good as those two beasts?" The guard nodded. Yes. After saying that, he seemed to feel that his words were a little harsh, so he comforted Old Ma. "Don't be sad, we're the same." After that, everyone felt that it was a little strange, and everyone was a little embarrassed. However, in the midst of the chaos, a petite figure quietly followed behind Lu Chen and the others, and snuck into the secret passage. Chapter 569. It had been a while since Lu Chen last came to the underground city in the mysterious cave. When he walked through the passageway and saw the majestic underground city again, his heart was still the same as when he first saw this place. A feeling of admiration welled up in his heart along with a slightly strange feeling. The blood-red moon was still floating in the sky, emitting a seemingly endless blood-red light. It seemed that it would never stop, nor would it stop. It was like this blood-red moon had existed in this place ever since Pan Gu created the world, and had never changed. When the red light shone on him, Lu Chen's body and footsteps paused. At that moment, he felt an unpleasant aura that suppressed his spiritual power. However, he was not afraid of it, nor did he panic. Firstly, he could endure this feeling. Secondly, he had secretly proven that although the aura of this blood moon was strange, It only suppressed most ordinary cultivators. On the other hand, the mysterious black fire in his body was not affected by this place once it was activated. Back then, black fire had helped him a lot when he was able to break through the siege of the devil cult followers. Of course, with his many years of experience, black fire had already saved him many times. Thinking of this, Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. He looked to his side and saw oxen and black dog walking over. Among them, Atsu's body seemed to have paused for a moment, but soon returned to normal. On the contrary, oxen, who had always been unfathomable, suddenly trembled, and its movements became a little slower after being bathed in the light of the blood moon. At the next moment, oxen seemed to have turned its huge horns with some difficulty, and let out a low moo. Then it suddenly staggered and almost fell to the ground. This time, both Lu Chen and Atsu were taken aback. No one expected that oxen would have such a big reaction when they walked into this underground blood moon city. It was even a little scary. Lu Chen quickly turned around and supported oxen's body. Atsu also rushed over in a hurry. It barked repeatedly and used its body to push against oxen's stomach, trying to make it stand steadily. However, oxen's body was a little too huge. Lu Chen and Atsu struggled to support it in a hurry. Fortunately, although oxen still looked a little uncomfortable, it managed to stand firmly on its own after shaking for a while. Then it slowly bent its legs and sat on the ground. Lu Chen was also stunned and puzzled. One must know that although the blood moon here had a strange power that could suppress many human cultivators, even if ordinary cultivators came in and felt uncomfortable, they wouldn't have such an obvious and serious reaction like oxen. Otherwise, they wouldn't have arranged for people from the Starry Hall to come here to do those secret things. The green ox knelt on the ground with its head drooped. After a while, it seemed to be in better spirits, but overall, it still gave off a rare feeling of illness. Lu Chen frowned and glanced at the blood moon in the sky. Then he whispered to Oxen, "What's going on? If it really can't stand the blood moon, let's go out first?" Oxen raised its pair of huge eyes and looked over Lu Chen's body at the houses below that were taller than ordinary human houses. It looked into the distance in silence. Its gaze swept across the street and finally fell on the center of the city, on the strange statue that connected the ground and the cave dome. "Moo," Oxen called out in a low voice. Lu Chen followed its gaze and looked in that direction. Then he hesitated for a moment and asked tentatively, "Do you want to go there?" Oxen nodded, but the black dog next to it seemed to be a little anxious and barked. Lu Chen was also a little worried. Looking at Oxen's dispirited appearance, he smiled bitterly and said, "There are two problems. First, you're too big and heavy. I can't move or push you. Second, we're only at the edge of the blood moon. Are you sure you won't die if we go further in?" Oxen hesitated for a moment, but it still looked at the statue in the distance with determination. Clearly, it still insisted on its idea. Atsu looked at it worriedly. However, Lu Chen wasn't Atsu, so he didn't have that kind of reverence for it. Therefore, Lu Chen quickly said without holding back, "Don't waste your time. I don't care if you want to die, but you're a treasure in the eyes of that damn Baldy. At the very least, I don't know what else he values more than you. If I really kill you here, that damn Baldy will fight me to the death." Oxen glared at Lu Chen with a hint of annoyance and anger in its eyes. Then it put on a disdainful expression. "Tui." Lu Chen slapped the top of the bull's head and scolded, "What are you pretending for? When I was still by that damn Baldy's side, you used that stupid look to trick me. Do you think I'll fall for it again?" A hint of helplessness appeared on Oxen's face as it fell silent. "Let's go." Lu Chen grabbed Oxen's head and pulled it back to where they came from. He said, "If you have the guts, you can ask that damn Baldy to send you down here himself. If anything happens to you, he'll be responsible for it. It has nothing to do with me. I don't care if you die or not." Atu was a little dumbfounded as he watched from the side. He did not expect Lu Chen to be so familiar with the green bull and treat it like an outsider. As for the green bull, it did not react much to Lu Chen's actions, perhaps because it was affected by the blood moon's brilliance or some other reason. Oxen even sighed softly. Yes, this cow sighed softly. There was a hint of helplessness in its voice, which was almost the same as a human's. Lu Chen didn't care about it, as if he was already used to it. Behind them, Atsu was a little puzzled. At the other corner of the cave, behind a hidden rock, a petite figure slowly poked her head out. She revealed a pair of bright eyes as she watched the scene. There was a hint of astonishment in her eyes. In the end, Oxen didn't insist or struggle too much. It just left with Lu Chen, even though it was unusually determined to come down to the underground city at the cost of fighting the guards. Therefore, it seemed that it had a strong start but a weak finish. However, from this, it could be seen that even though it was not as obvious as perfected Lord Tianlan's reaction, the Green Ox clearly viewed Lu Chen in a different light. Lu Chen brought the Green Bull and the Black Dog Atu down for a walk, then turned around and left without doing anything. It could be said that he was all bark and no bite. However, after they left, another figure suddenly walked out of the empty underground cave. It was an extremely beautiful young lady. It was White Lotus. Bai Lian first glanced at the passageway that they had come in from, and then a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. She then looked at the blood moon in the sky, and after a while, she seemed to have made a decision. She strode forward and walked towards the strange statue in the center of the city, as if she wanted to investigate it herself. As she walked, her footsteps and movements seemed to be a little unnatural compared to usual. She should have been somewhat affected by the suppression of the blood moon, but it was still much better than the Green Ox. The suppression was not as great. As she stepped on the long street, a series of crisp footsteps echoed in the city. When the sound wave drifted, it spread to a deep dry well in a courtyard in a corner. A shadow in the darkness moved slightly. It raised its head and glanced at the world above. After a while, it seemed to move very slowly and then slowly stood up. Chapter 570. The huge underground cave was now silent. There were no signs of people or animals, including some common underground creatures such as bats and mice. White Lotus didn't see any of them. There was only the almost omnipresent blood-red light that shone down from the blood-red moon in the sky, filling every corner of this place. After White Lotus walked on the long street for a while, she couldn't help but look around. Those tall houses and pavilions were obviously not suitable for humans to live in. Although the old houses were there, the owners were gone. Those empty tall doors and big houses were stained with the color of blood, giving off a strange and eerie feeling, as if in the next moment, some kind of monster would rush out from some dark red corner and pounce on White Lotus. This feeling was very bad and frightening. White Lotus's delicate brows furrowed. She looked a little hesitant, as if she wanted to retreat and leave this place. However, her eyes then looked towards the depths of this underground city. After hesitating for a while, she finally continued to walk towards the tall but strange statue. Since she was already here, she had to take a clear look. This place was tightly guarded by the men of the Floating Clouds Agency and the Starry Hall. There had to be some kind of huge secret hidden underground. White Lotus walked step by step and approached the statue. Along the way, she walked very carefully. At the same time, she secretly felt strange. Logically speaking, the underground territory was so huge. With Zheng Xianmeng's strength and deep foundation in the immortal city for so many years, it was really impossible for him not to discover the strangeness of this underground. Then, why was this underground city only exposed recently? Could it be that it was really the ancestors of Zheng Xianmeng who sealed this place? Just when White Lotus was puzzled, when she walked past the door of a big house on the long street, she suddenly heard a sound. The sound was very soft and not very loud. However, because the surroundings were too quiet, it became especially clear and White Lotus heard it immediately. White Lotus immediately stopped in her tracks. Her expression changed slightly, and she turned towards the house. The big house looked no different from the other houses that they had passed before. Looking from the door, it was also empty, and there was nothing suspicious about it. However, White Lotus didn't think that what she just heard was just an illusion. She heard it very clearly. She stood in the same place and stared at the depths of the house. For a moment, she was a little hesitant. Should she go in or leave this place? This underground city was so strange. Obviously, it was very likely that there was something strange and terrifying hidden here. However, White Lotus immediately remembered that Lu Qin had brought Oxen and Black Dog here. Judging from their actions and expressions, they didn't seem to feel any signs of danger here. Even if Lu Qin could act, Oxen and Black Dog definitely couldn't. White Lotus lifted her foot and wanted to walk towards the house, but she immediately put it down. After hesitating for a few times, she couldn't make a decision in the end. It could be said that her heart was in a dilemma. However, at this moment, White Lotus glanced at the ground in front of her and was suddenly shocked. At this moment, other than the red light shining on her body and drawing out a shadow on the ground, there was actually another shadow behind her. It was taller and longer than her, and just like that, it appeared behind her without a sound. White Lotus's body instantly turned as cold as water. She even held her breath. Lu Qin brought Oxen and Black Dog back to the surface. Seeing that they came out of the tunnel so quickly, the guards who were originally discussing among themselves were a little surprised. At the same time, many of them had a look of relief on their faces. In any case, in this short period of time, the most they could do was to go down and take a look at the scenery below. After that, they would have to hurry back. In such a short period of time, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything bad even if they wanted to. Everyone had a heavy responsibility on their shoulders, so it was better to avoid trouble. Immediately, someone came over to greet Lu Qin politely. Lu Qin responded with a few perfunctory words, and then turned to look at Oxen. After leaving the light of the Blood Moon underground, Oxen's mental state was obviously a lot better. However, its head was still drooping, and it seemed to be a little dispirited. Lu Qin thought for a while, then left the tunnel entrance with Oxen and Atsu. On the way, he greeted Old Ma, who was standing on the side. Old Ma rushed over and said with a surprised expression, "What happened? You came out so quickly?" "I'll tell you in detail later." Lu Qin also said perfunctory words to Old Ma. Then he gestured to Old Ma to help him. Together, they supported the sickly Oxen and walked toward Mount Tianlong. As for the direction, it was naturally the Kunlun Palace of Supreme Lord Tianlan. Therefore, about an hour later, although his spirit had recovered slightly, the Green Bull, who had spent a lot of time on the way, finally returned to the Kunlun Hall under Lu Chen's strong request. Fortunately, Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't go out today. He stayed in the palace. When the footsteps of Lu Chen and Old Ma came from the gate, as well as the slightly messy steps of the two spirit beasts, Supreme Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the lotus throne, glanced at the gate. After a while, his attention seemed to be completely focused on Oxen. Old Ma, who was following Lu Chen, was about to bow to Supreme Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the lotus throne in the distance. However, at that moment he felt dizzy, and then a tall and sturdy figure suddenly appeared in front of him. In that short moment, Supreme Lord Tianlan had passed through the long palace and directly came to the side of Oxen. Oxen raised its head, looked at Supreme Lord Tianlan, and called out in a low voice. Supreme Lord Tianlan's expression changed slightly. It seemed that his expression was a little ugly. He walked forward with a sullen face. He first looked at Oxen's complexion. Then he suddenly put his hand on Oxen's head, touched its ears, and opened its eyelids to have a look. Then he put his hand on the side of Oxen's chest and carefully felt it. His expression became even more ugly. Where did it go? Supreme Lord Tianlan turned to Lu Chen and asked. Oxen took a look at Lu Chen, and there seemed to be some hidden meaning in its eyes. However, Lu Chen did not keep it a secret at all. In the blink of an eye, he told everything clearly from the beginning to the end, including the matter of Oxen and Atsu strolling on the street at the beginning. After hearing that Oxen actually ran to the underground city, Supreme Lord Tianlan first snorted. Then, when he heard Lu Chen say that it immediately collapsed after entering the underground city, he couldn't help but shake his head. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Then he waved to the side and said, "Old Ma, you can leave now." Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but he still obeyed and left the hall. The moment he stepped out of the door, he vaguely heard Supreme Lord Tianlan instructing Lu Chen. "You also go down. Do you feel uncomfortable?" Lu Chen slightly lowered his eyes and said, "Well, I feel that after staying there for a long time, my whole body has begun to feel strange. I can't use my strength. and even the circulation of spiritual qi has slowed down. If I really have to fight fiercely in the underground city, I think I can only use 4 or 5 of my full strength at most." Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and looked at Lu Chen for a moment. Then he sat beside Oxen, pressed its head with one hand and pressed its chest with the other. After a while, a warm breath of pure yang was slowly emitted from his body. With the appearance of this yang qi, Oxen's face was obviously much better. Lu Chen, on the other hand, stood aside and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan's broad and strong back from the side. Suddenly, a daring idea occurred to him. They are all divine transformation realm perfected cultivators, and they are so powerful that they can shake the world. But will they also be like Elder Yin Shouyang of the devil cult, who had his heart meridian cut off and could no longer fight back? What was the name of that mysterious magic incantation formation? Well, by the way, it seemed to be called God-subduing spell? Chapter 571. At that moment, Lu Chen was a little absent-minded. Just now, he suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he recalled what happened in the barren valley. Once upon a time, he always felt that that memory was accompanied by unforgettable pain, which was deeply buried in his heart and would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would never be able to find peace and forget it. After all, every time he suffered the pain of being burned by the black flames, he would recall the people and events of the past, as well as the blood on his hands, as well as the things he had seen in those dark times that he did not want to recall. However, now that it had come to this, he realized to his shock that he had underestimated time in the end. No matter how deep the pain was, it would be relieved with the passage of time. If people were not repeatedly reminded of it, perhaps those memories would be quietly erased from the depths of their consciousness. Who would deliberately recall those painful memories, unless it was the kind of unforgettable hatred that had been engraved in their hearts? Young children used to naively think that they would remember every beautiful moment, and tell themselves that this moment was so important that they would never forget it. Then, when they grew up and looked back on the past, they found that everything had been covered by the dust of the past, and they could no longer recall the memories of those years. However, they still remembered the solemn and beautiful feelings of the children. "What's wrong with you?" Suddenly, the voice of Supreme Lord Tianlan came from the front, awakening Lu Chen from that somewhat bewildered state. He turned around and saw that Oxen, who had been lying on the ground sickly, had now stood up and seemed to be in much better spirits. He didn't know what method Supreme Lord Tianlan had used just now, but it was like a miraculous cure that had instantly freed Oxen from the state of being suppressed by the aura of the blood moon. After looking around, Oxen walked to its favorite seat at the side of the hall and lay down. Atsu followed it and wagged its tail gently, looking up and down curiously at Oxen's body, as if it was very surprised by this magical change. "I'm fine." Lu Chen naturally changed the topic. Looking at Oxen, he asked Supreme Lord Tianlan, "What's wrong with this bull?" Although the underground blood moon was strange, it shouldn't be to this extent. These days, quite a number of human cultivators from Fuyunji and Starry Hall have gone down there. Some of them have high attainments, but I have never heard of anyone having such a big reaction like this one. Perfected Lord Tianlan took another look at him and said indifferently, "I'm not sure either. Perhaps the blood moon's suppression on Oxen is particularly strong." Lu Chen mumbled, "It's strange this time as well. I remember that whenever this cow was in danger, it would always sense it beforehand and avoid it. It's never been in such a sorry state like this." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and hesitated. When Lu Chen saw his indifferent expression, he bid farewell and walked out. Watching his disciple leave, Perfected Lord Tianlan's expressionless face gradually changed. He turned to look at Oxen, who was lying on the other side of the hall. He then slowly walked over and sat down beside Oxen. His expression gradually became a little strange, abnormally complicated, and mixed with some inexplicable emotions. In the quiet hall, after a long time, there seemed to be a sigh. Then someone said faintly, "Are you already old?" In the mysterious underground city shrouded by the light of the blood moon, White Lotus felt cold all over, as if she had fallen into an ice cellar. She stared at the shadow reflected on the ground in front of her. Other than her own shadow, there was another shadow that was even bigger. This was an underground world that was so quiet that it could even be said to be dead. Under the blood-red light, there seemed to be no living creatures here. As long as the human cultivators in Zhengxianmeng did not come here, there would be no human figures, no animals, and not even a common plant. Under the blood-red light, even the omnipresent sounds of insects could not be found. Therefore, it was hard not to associate the figure that suddenly appeared in this place with something like a demon or a ghost. For White Lotus, that short moment felt like a particularly long and torturous time. Her hand seemed to stretch forward in a panic, but she did not look back. Suddenly, she let out a low shout, and her petite body suddenly flew forward. At the same time, she waved her hands backward with force. Then the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped, and 2 icy snowstorms swept over and hit her back. Ha! The mysterious figure seemed to be surprised. Snow Wind Scripture? The Snow Wind Scripture was actually not very famous. In the world of cultivation, more than half of the people had never heard of this thing. However, in the hearts of those who knew about this thing, the Snow Wind Scripture was undoubtedly the most powerful thing in the world. The Snow Wind Scripture was undoubtedly related to Hakushin Jinkuan of the Kunlun party. In fact, before Hakushin Jinkuan, this Snow Wind Scripture had never appeared, so some people thought that perhaps Hakushin Jinkuan had created this Snow Wind Scripture. However, there were also people who privately thought that although Hakushin Jinkuan was very powerful, his and Lord Tianlan's master, Master Tian Hong, was the truly amazing heaven's favored one, and most likely inherited it from their master. However, this mysterious and unfathomable Tao, art, and divine power seemed to have always had a bumpy fate. When perfected Lord Baichun was still alive, he did not teach his 2 eldest disciples who had such great aptitudes. In the end, he only taught it to his last disciple, the young girl White Lotus, who was only about 10 years old. Now that he had passed away, White Lotus might be the last person in the world who knew such a powerful and strange Snow Wind Scripture. However, even though the Snow Wind Scripture was powerful, if one's cultivation was not enough, it would still be a tree without roots, a duckweed without roots. After the initial shock, the black figure swayed a few times. Although it seemed slow, it was actually very fast. In an instant, it flashed past the 2 snowstorms that looked like they could freeze a person's flesh and blood, and caught up with White Lotus. White Lotus felt a sharp aura locked onto her back like a blade. That feeling of uneasiness and danger grew stronger. In a moment of desperation, she was about to make another killing move when suddenly her vision blurred. That black figure appeared in front of her like a ghost. White Lotus was shocked. Her body could not stop and crashed forward. But at this moment, her eyes suddenly flashed past a ferocious mask with a green face and long fangs. The person who appeared in front of her was wearing this mask. White Lotus's heart suddenly tightened. At that moment, she suddenly thought of a person, that person, although she had never seen him but she had heard of him countless times in Zhengxianmeng. Elder Ghost of the Evil Faction. Chapter 572. Lu Chen left the Kunlun Hall with Atsu. When he came out, he saw Old Ma standing alone outside the door. He walked over to Old Ma and greeted him from afar. Old Ma smiled and nodded as he walked over. "I thought you went back first," Lu Chen said to Old Ma with a smile. Old Ma smiled and shook his head. He glanced in the direction of the Kunlun Hall, and then looked at Lu Chen with a questioning look. Lu Chen shook his head, indicating that there was nothing inside. Old Ma grunted in acknowledgement. Then he said to Lu Chen, "Oh, by the way, Hall Master Shui from the Floating Clouds Division sent someone to look for you. He wants to invite you over to discuss something." Lu Chen was startled and said, "What did they say?" Old Ma said, "That's nothing, but I saw that the messenger who came just now looked normal. He didn't look anxious or anxious. I don't think it's anything urgent." Lu Chen nodded. Thinking that there was nothing urgent at the moment, he walked towards the Fuyunji Hall. Not long after, they arrived outside the Fuyunji Hall. After all, this place was not too far from the Kunlun Hall. Someone had already announced their arrival. Not long after, they politely invited Lu Chen and Old Ma in with Shui Ying's orders. As for the black dog, it didn't follow them in. Recently, the dog didn't seem to like this kind of grand and spacious hall very much. It didn't want to go in easily, so it ran away on its own. Lu Chen and Old Ma didn't care about this. The black dog was getting smarter and had a backer. No one on Mount Celestial Dragon would deliberately make things difficult for it, so it ran around freely. After a while, the two of them were brought to the living room of the Fuyunji Hall. Shuang sat there and waited. But what surprised Lu Chen and Old Ma was that there was another person in the room. It was Chun He, who had been betrayed by Lu Chen from the devil cult. Logically speaking, there were many reasons why Chun He would betray the evil sect and attack his old master, but Lu Chen's role was undoubtedly at the top of the list. Without Lu Chen, Chun He might have died in Fuyunji's prison, and not become an honored guest of Fuyunji after betraying the devil cult. It was precisely because of this that Chun He spent most of his time by Lu Chen's side when he first defected, showing his loyalty to Lu Chen. In the eyes of outsiders, he was the new generation of Lu Chen's henchmen. However, for some unknown reason, after the Fuyun Company had schemed for a long time and finally dealt a heavy blow to the evil cult, almost completely uprooting this malignant tumor from the huge immortal city, Lu Chen, intentionally or unintentionally, began to distance himself from Chun He. Usually they were just acquaintances who nodded at each other, and did not really have the intention to accept him as a confidant. This was out of many people's expectations, including the leader of Fuyunji, Shuang, and Chun He himself. They all thought that Lu Chen would naturally expand his power. Shuang was very vigilant about this, and Chun He was very excited. He couldn't wait to become Lu Chen's core team. When Lu Chen truly inherited the foundation of Lord Tianlan, he would be able to soar to the sky. So during that period of time, Chun He did everything possible to express goodwill to Lu Chen, and worked hard to leave a good impression on his future boss. Of course, the final result was not bad, but he did not catch Elder Ghost, so it was not perfect. Maybe it was because of this that Lu Chen hated him? Chun He could not help but think so. He was a defector, and in terms of experience and strength, he could not compare to the people on Fuyunji's side. In order to survive, there were almost no surprises in the choice he had to make next. He quickly approached Shuang, and after Shuang slightly relented and showed some intentions, he officially defected to her side. Seeing Lu Chen and Old Ma walk in, Shuang and Chun He also stood up, a smile on their faces. Shuang's smile was calm and light, elegant and polite, while Chun He's smile was a little more enthusiastic, and he even took the initiative to greet Lu Chen and Old Ma. Lu Chen also smiled, seemingly not minding Chun He's action of approaching Shuang. After exchanging a few words of modesty with him, Lu Chen smiled and sat down on his seat. He then smiled at Shuang and said, "Hall Master Shui, why have you called me here today?" Shuang nodded, not intending to beat around the bush, and said, "I heard that you plan to tell the true Lord that there is a lack of manpower in the Western continent to hunt down the remnants of the devil cult, so you want to send Old Ma there?" Lu Chen's eyes flashed, but his expression did not change. Instead, it was Old Ma who was sitting beside him who was faintly surprised, not quite understanding why Shuang suddenly brought this up. At this moment, Lu Chen said, "Yes, I have already mentioned this to Master, and wanted to send Old Ma over. But Master said that the immortal city also needs a lot of manpower, and it is not appropriate to send too many people out, so he declined." Shuang nodded, looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "It's like this, I invited junior brother Lu here today because there is something I want to tell you. The matter of hunting down the evildoers of the devil cult in the Western continent is indeed very important, and it is true that there is a lack of manpower there. So after thinking about it, I have decided to send Chun He over. He has been to the Western continent before, and has had a lot of contact with the local devil cult demons, so he is the best candidate for this task." Lu Chen and Old Ma's expressions changed slightly, and then they looked at Chun He together. They saw Chun He smiling, as if nothing had happened. Lu Chen frowned, and he pondered deeply for a moment before he said, "You have to personally tell Master about this matter. I have already reported it to Lord True Lord." Shuang smiled and used a gentle voice to interrupt Lu Chen's words, and said he has approved. Lord True Lord Tianlan had approved Shui Ying's request? Lu Chen's expression changed again, and he could not help but look up at Shui Ying's smiling face. After a while he said, "That is good." Then he turned to look at Qin He, and this time his face was full of smiles, and said, "There are a lot of evildoers in the Western continent. Brother Qin will have to work hard in the future." Qin He shook his head and said with a smile, No, we are all working for Lord True Lord. For the sake of his grand plans, it is only our duty." Lu Chun and Old Ma looked at each other, and then looked away. The two sides chatted happily for a while, and then Lu Chun and Old Ma said goodbye, but they were very quiet on the road. After walking for a while, Old Ma lowered his voice and asked, "Lord True Lord did not tell you about these things?" Lu Chun shook his head, and just as he was about to speak, he found that he and Old Ma had walked to the row of houses where the elite disciples of the Kunlun party were. Lu Chun was silent for a moment, and looked at the familiar house, and suddenly asked, "White Lotus is still living in Su Qingjuan's house, right?" Old Ma grunted, and was about to say something, when he suddenly saw someone coming from the road in front of them, and turned into the row of houses about 100 feet away from them. From afar, it was He, who they had not seen for a while. Old Ma frowned and muttered, "That person's cultivation is not bad. He seems to have a fierce murderous aura." Chapter 573. He didn't seem to notice Lu Chen and Old Ma coming from afar. He turned into the back of the row of houses expressionlessly, and soon disappeared. Lu Chen glanced at Old Ma. Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "He should also be living here." Among the group of people that the Kunlun party transferred here last time, Fuyunji has basically gathered and settled down. But I can't remember which room he lives in exactly now. Lu Chen nodded slightly and didn't say anything. In Kunlun's sect, he was a proud son of heaven with boundless glory, an outstanding talent among the young generation of disciples, but after coming to the Immortal City, because the true Immortal Alliance had gathered the most outstanding talents in the world, not to mention others, there were 5 to 6 deity transformation stage perfected cultivators who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, and there were even more nascent soul stage perfected cultivators, who would pay special attention to one of the countless Jindan stage cultivators. In a place like the Immortal City where all the power and precious resources in the world were gathered, to a certain extent, the importance of the cultivation of an ordinary cultivator was much less than in other places. The people here were more used to looking at a person's background and identity to judge his strength. This was a kind of alienation, but also a kind of reality. For example, Lu Chen's cultivation and realm were obscure and hard to understand. On the surface, he might not be stronger than He, but in the Immortal City, his reputation was undoubtedly 100 times better than He's. Whether it was Lu Chen or Old Ma, they both had a lot of troubles at the moment. And He had never done anything out of line or eye-catching since he came to the Immortal City, so they didn't care about him. Because of the incident with He Gang, Lu Chen naturally had a kind of vigilance and alienation towards He, but now he didn't have any thoughts of targeting this person. The past was over, and the secrets were covered in dust. No one would ever mention the past again. Lu Chen shook his head slightly, tossing those memories aside. He then said to Old Ma in a low voice, "Just now in Fuyunji, you didn't show any dissatisfaction in front of Blood Warbler, did you?" Old Ma was startled. His expression turned solemn, and he recalled for a while with some seriousness. Then he shook his head and said, "No, from the beginning to the end, I had a smile on my face. There was absolutely no anger or annoyance on my face." Lu Chen glanced at him, snorted coldly and said, "So you are unhappy in your heart?" Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "If it were you, would you still be happy?" "Of course not." Lu Chen admitted to this point very straightforwardly. Then his expression darkened slightly as he said, "Blood Warbler called Chen He over in front of us and purposely brought up this matter. Could it be that she's trying to show off to us? Recently, she has been getting more and more out of hand." Old Ma frowned. His first reaction was not to reply, but to look around first. Seeing that there was no one around them, only the two of them, he let out a sigh of relief. Then he said in a low voice, "Even if you want to complain, let's find a safe place with no one to curse, okay? There is no one around here. Lu Chen said calmly. Otherwise, Atsu will find out. Atsu? Old Ma was shocked and said, didn't it just run to? Before he finished speaking, Old Ma saw a dog's head poking out from the corner of a house in front of them. It glanced at them, and then yawned lazily. It was Atsu. Old Ma swallowed the words that he didn't want to say. He looked at Atsu and clicked his tongue. I've watched this dog grow up. He has changed so much. I don't know what he ate, but he seems to have become a demon. Old Ma was speechless. Lu Chen ignored Old Ma's praise for Atsu and just waved at Atsu. Old Ma saw this from the side, and subconsciously thought that Atsu would probably be like those legendary assassins who appeared and disappeared without a trace with a whoosh, and then suddenly jump out at a critical moment to deal a fatal blow. In the end, the black dog lay on the ground and buried its head between its two front paws. It looked like it was sunbathing and getting ready to sleep. Lu Chen's movement froze and he cursed. It sounded like he was exasperated at Old Ma's failure to meet his expectations, but other than that, he did not express anything else. He pulled Old Ma and continued to walk forward, but he still lowered his voice. What are you thinking about? Old Ma was quite straightforward and said, right now, the entire Floating Clouds agency knows that I'm one of your people. However, True Monarch has prevented me from leaving. Yet you've agreed to Blood Warbler's request. Isn't this somewhat inappropriate? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and said, the damn Baldy has always been strange, and his actions are always unexpected. It is hard to say. After a pause, Lu Chen said, however, I have been in the limelight recently, and Shuang has been in charge of Fuyunji for many years. She has always been known as the #1 person under Tianlan. The damn Baldy probably did this because he weighed the pros and cons. Old Ma sighed and said, is he sacrificing a small fry like me to comfort the other side? Lu Chen glanced at him and said, don't talk nonsense about sacrifice. I didn't ask you to die. Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, fortunately those big shots outside don't know about our little business. Otherwise, if they send someone to kill him, how are you going to defend yourself in front of perfected immortal? Lu Chen also laughed and said, what's the big deal? I will just say that you did it. He patted Old Ma's shoulder and said with a smile, anyway, you are already dissatisfied. You have the motive, and we don't want to talk about the means. The murderer is you. Bah! Old Ma spat angrily. You are the most useless boss I have ever worked for. Lu Chen laughed. He sat in his room. The door was closed, the window was closed, and even the curtains were drawn, so the room was very dark and quiet. It was probably because of this that the hearty laughter from outside could be heard from afar, causing him to raise his head and look in the direction of the door. His face was still young and handsome. He was still high-spirited and had achievements that many people envied and yearned for. He dreamed that one day he could become the second Lu Chen, and then he would have no regrets in his life. But in He Yi's heart, there was a lot of regret and hatred. In fact, sometimes he also had some doubts. His achievements were obviously good enough, but he was always not satisfied. He lowered his head. The dim light fell on his face, only illuminating half of his cheeks. He seemed to be sitting in the boundary between light and darkness. He seemed to be thinking, but also seemed to be hesitating. He was like a child standing on the edge of a cliff. In front of him was the most beautiful flower in the world, but below his feet was a bottomless abyss. Should he take this step? He slowly pulled out his long sword. The sword light reflected in his eyes, like a ghost in the dark. He didn't know how long he sat like this. It was quiet around him until the sky outside the room darkened, and his room was completely plunged into darkness. Late at night, he slowly raised his head, stood up with his sword, and then opened the door and walked out. You're tuning into the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.